Hey there, history buffs and sleepy scholars. Welcome to another deep dive, this time into the captivating world of medieval education. Now, when we think of medieval school, chances are certain images pop into your head, right? Maybe you picture candle-lit classrooms, gruff monks wielding birch rods, and students hunched over dusty tomes, desperately trying to decipher ancient Latin. Or perhaps your mind conjures up scenes from movies or TV shows, filled with knights learning chivalry, princesses mastering embroidery, and peasants toiling away, completely excluded from any form of formal learning. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. And to be fair, some of those images do hold a kernel of truth. But the reality of medieval education was far more complex, nuanced, and frankly more fascinating than most of us realize. It wasn't a monolithic, one-size-fits-all system. It was a patchwork of different institutions, curricula, and opportunities, varying widely depending on your social status, your location, and even your gender. So before we plunge headfirst into the specifics of what medieval school kids actually learned, let's take a moment to gently dispel some of the common myths and misconceptions that tend to cloud our understanding, because trust me, there are plenty. One of the biggest misconceptions, and I think this one is pretty widespread, is that education in the Middle Ages was solely the domain of the church. Yes, the church, particularly monasteries and cathedrals, played a vital role in preserving and transmitting knowledge, especially in the early medieval period. We'll definitely be exploring that in detail. But to assume that all education was religiously focused, or that the church was the only educator, is simply not accurate. As towns and cities grew, so did the demand for more secular forms of education, leading to the rise of town schools, guild schools, and eventually those amazing hubs of learning we call universities. These institutions offered a broader range of subjects, catering to the needs of merchants, craftsmen, and administrators. So while religion was undoubtedly a central aspect of medieval life and learning, it wasn't the whole picture, not by a long shot. Another common misconception is that medieval education was universally inaccessible, available only to the wealthy elite. Now again, there's a grain of truth in there. Access to formal schooling was certainly limited by social status, and peasants and serfs rarely had the opportunity to attend established schools. However, that doesn't mean that education was completely absent from their lives. Many children learned practical skills and trades through apprenticeships, passing down knowledge and expertise from one generation to the next. And in some communities, local priests or educated individuals offered basic instruction in reading and writing to a wider segment of the population. Plus, oral traditions, storytelling, and religious instruction played a crucial role in shaping the worldview and knowledge of those who didn't have access to formal schooling. It just looked a little different. Then there's the idea that medieval education was stagnant and unchanging. We often picture the Middle Ages as a period of intellectual darkness, a dark age between the brilliance of classical antiquity and the Renaissance. But this is a gross oversimplification. In reality, medieval education underwent significant transformations and experienced periods of remarkable intellectual flourishing. Think of the Carolingian Renaissance, the revival of learning under Charlemagne in the 8th and 9th centuries, or the rise of universities in the 12th and 13th centuries. These were periods of intense intellectual activity, where scholars rediscovered classical texts, developed new methods of inquiry, and pushed the boundaries of knowledge. Education was constantly evolving, adapting to changing social, political, and economic conditions. And let's not forget the role of women in medieval education. It's often assumed that women were completely excluded from learning, relegated to domestic duties, and denied any intellectual pursuits. And while it's true that opportunities for women were significantly limited compared to men, particularly in formal educational settings, there were exceptions. Convents offered women a space to learn and pursue intellectual interests, producing remarkable scholars, writers, and artists like Hildegard of Bingen, who we'll hear about later. Noble women also received education, often through private tutors, preparing them for their roles in managing households, governing estates, and participating in courtly life. So while access was unequal, women were certainly not entirely absent from the landscape of medieval education. Finally, let's address the notion that medieval education was purely rote memorization, devoid of critical thinking and creativity. Now, memorization was an important aspect of medieval learning, particularly in the early stages. Students spent countless hours memorizing prayers, hymns, and Latin grammar rules. But this wasn't the only method of instruction. As universities developed, scholars began to emphasize critical thinking, debate, and the application of knowledge to real-world problems. Scholasticism, with its focus on logic and reasoning, encouraged students to analyze arguments, challenge assumptions, and synthesize information from different sources. And of course, the arts, music, and practical skills demanded creativity and innovation. So while memorization played a role, it wasn't the be-all and end-all of medieval education. So as we embark on this journey through the medieval classroom, let's keep these nuances in mind. Let's challenge our assumptions, question the common myths, and appreciate the complexity and diversity of medieval education. Because beneath the surface of those seemingly simple images of monks, dusty books, and birch rods, lies a world of intellectual curiosity, innovation, and a deep commitment to the pursuit of knowledge. Now let's dim those lights just a little bit more and settle in as we begin to uncover the secrets of what medieval school kids actually learned. Alright, settle in, everyone. Let's journey back in time to the early medieval period, roughly from the year 500 to 1000. This is a time often called the Dark Ages, but that's a bit of a misnomer, isn't it? It wasn't exactly dark, just different. A period of transition, a period where the knowledge of the old Roman Empire was fading, but new seeds of learning were just starting to sprout. And where were these seeds being nurtured? Well, primarily in monasteries. Think of monasteries as the libraries and universities of their day. After the fall of Rome, many cities and infrastructure crumbled, trade routes were disrupted, and the focus shifted towards smaller, more self-sufficient communities. Monasteries became havens of stability, places where books were copied and preserved, and where a select few were taught to read and write. Now, why monasteries? A good question. Monks were, first and foremost, dedicated to religious life, to prayer, and to serving God. But a core part of their daily routine also involved reading and studying religious texts. They needed to understand the Bible, the writings of the Church Fathers, and the rules of their monastic order, like the rule of Saint Benedict. And to understand these texts, well, you needed to be able to read. That's where the schools came in. Monasteries weren't just places of worship. They were centers of learning. They established schools primarily for the training of future monks. These were often small, intimate settings, sometimes just a handful of students gathered around a more experienced monk. The goal wasn't mass education, not by a long shot. It was to ensure a continuous supply of literate individuals who could maintain the religious and administrative functions of the monastery. So imagine the scene: a quiet cloister, sunlight streaming through arched windows, the scent of beeswax and parchment filling the air. A young novice, perhaps barely a teenager, sits diligently copying a passage from the Bible. The master, an older monk with tired eyes and ink-stained fingers, guides him, patiently correcting his mistakes. These monastic schools were truly vital. They were essentially the life rafts of knowledge during a tumultuous period. They kept the flame of literacy alive, preventing the complete loss of classical learning. They painstakingly copied manuscripts, preserving the works of Roman authors like Virgil, Cicero, and Ovid. Even though the primary focus was on religious texts, they understood the importance of preserving these classical works. They knew that these works contained valuable insights into language, rhetoric, and philosophy, skills that were essential for understanding and interpreting religious texts too. Think about it. Before the printing press, every book had to be copied by hand. Can you imagine the dedication, the sheer amount of time and effort it took to produce a single manuscript? Each letter carefully formed, each page meticulously decorated. It was an act of devotion, a labor of love, and a crucial contribution to the preservation of knowledge. Now, these schools weren't just for aspiring monks. Sometimes wealthy families would send their sons to monasteries for an education, even if they didn't intend for them to take vows. These students, known as oblates, would receive the same instruction as the novice monks, learning to read, write, and study religious texts. This provided a pathway for some laypeople to gain literacy, which was incredibly rare at the time. However, let's be clear, education in the early Middle Ages was not widespread. It was a privilege reserved for a select few. The vast majority of the population, especially in rural areas, remained illiterate. They relied on oral tradition, stories, and songs to transmit their culture and knowledge. But the monastic schools were essential bridges, keeping the link to the classical past alive and laying the foundation for future educational developments. It's easy to underestimate the impact of these quiet, secluded centers of learning, isn't it? Hidden away, often struggling against the odds, they were the unsung heroes of intellectual preservation. They weren't flashy, they weren't particularly innovative, but they were absolutely essential. They kept the light of learning flickering during a period when it could easily have been extinguished. Consider this, without the dedicated scribes in these monastic scriptoria, copying and recopying ancient texts, many of the works we study today from that period would have disappeared. We wouldn't have access to the wisdom and knowledge accumulated over centuries. They provided a vital link between the classical world and the developing societies of medieval Europe. These weren't bustling universities, full of debate and groundbreaking ideas. They were sanctuaries of quiet study, where the slow, deliberate act of copying and interpreting texts was paramount. But this slow, deliberate work was incredibly important. It ensured that the seeds of learning were carefully nurtured and protected, ready to blossom in the centuries to come. So when you picture the early Middle Ages, don't just think of knights and battles and hardship. Think of these quiet monasteries, filled with diligent monks, patiently preserving the knowledge of the past and paving the way for a brighter future. These places were more than just religious centers. They were beacons of learning in a world struggling to rebuild itself. They are a vital yet often overlooked chapter in the story of education, and soon we'll see how this chapter gets even more interesting. Alright, settle in, because we're about to dive deep into the educational world of the monastic school, specifically what they actually taught. Now, when we think of the Middle Ages, it's easy to picture knights in shining armor and grand castles. But behind all that pomp and circumstance, there was a surprisingly structured system of learning taking place within the walls of monasteries. These weren't just places for prayer and contemplation. They were vital centers for preserving knowledge and, crucially, for educating the next generation. Think of these monasteries as the libraries and universities of their time, all rolled into one. They were often the only places where books were readily available and where individuals had the opportunity to learn how to read and write. And at the heart of this learning was the curriculum, a carefully designed path meant to shape young minds, well, mostly young boys, as we'll explore later on in this series when we tackle female education. So what exactly was on the syllabus at these monastic schools? Well, the primary focus was unequivocally religious. Makes sense, right? These institutions were, after all, dedicated to the service of God. The The main goal was to train future monks and priests, individuals who could understand and interpret the scriptures, perform religious rituals, and generally uphold the teachings of the church. This meant a heavy emphasis on religious texts. Students would spend countless hours poring over the Bible, specifically the Vulgate, which was the Latin translation. They weren't just reading it, they were dissecting it, memorizing it, and internalizing it. Imagine trying to memorize the entire Bible in Latin. Talk about dedication, or maybe just a serious lack of Netflix. Beyond the Bible, other important religious texts were studied, including the writings of the Church Fathers, figures like Saint Augustine, Saint Jerome, and Saint Ambrose. These individuals were considered foundational thinkers within the Church, and their works provided guidance on theology, morality, and spiritual practice. Think of them as the ancient influencers, shaping beliefs and behaviors for centuries to come. Studying these works wasn't just about understanding doctrine, it was about learning how to live a virtuous and God-fearing life. But it wasn't all about religion, or at least not entirely. Another crucial element of the monastic curriculum was Latin. Now, you might be thinking, Latin? Why? Well, Latin was the language of the church, the language of scholarship, and the lingua franca of educated elites across Europe. It was the key to unlocking a vast treasure trove of knowledge, from religious texts to classical literature to legal documents. Mastering Latin was essential for anyone who wanted to participate in intellectual life or hold a position of authority within the church. Students would learn grammar, vocabulary, and syntax through rigorous drills and exercises. They'd practice reading, writing, and speaking Latin, often using textbooks that had been in circulation for centuries. And believe me, these weren't exactly engaging page-turners. They were dense, technical, and required immense patience. But the rewards were significant. Fluency in Latin opened doors to a world of learning and opportunity. It allowed students to access the wisdom of the past, communicate with scholars from different regions, and participate in the vibrant intellectual debates of the time. Plus, let's be honest, it just sounded really impressive. Now, I know what you're thinking. Religious texts and Latin sounds a bit dry, right? Well, thankfully, the monastic curriculum wasn't entirely devoid of artistic expression. Music played a surprisingly important role. In fact, it was considered an essential part of religious life and a valuable tool for spiritual development. Monastic schools typically included instruction in Gregorian chant, a form of plain chant that was used in liturgical services. Students would learn to sing these chants, often spending hours practicing their vocal techniques and memorizing complex musical scores. It was a demanding discipline, requiring both musical talent and a deep understanding of religious texts. The importance of music extended beyond just liturgical performance. It was also seen as a way to cultivate inner harmony and connect with the divine. Music was believed to have a powerful effect on the soul, capable of inspiring devotion, promoting contemplation, and even healing emotional wounds. It was a form of prayer, a way to communicate with God through sound. Furthermore, the study of music was often intertwined with the study of mathematics. Medieval scholars believed that music was governed by mathematical principles, and that understanding these principles could lead to a deeper understanding of the universe itself. This connection between music and mathematics would later become a key element of the quadrivium, one of the four mathematical arts that formed the basis of higher education in the later Middle Ages. But we'll get to that in due time. So to recap, the curriculum of monastic schools in the early medieval period was heavily focused on religious texts, Latin, and music. These three elements were seen as essential for training future monks and priests, preserving knowledge, and cultivating spiritual growth. While it might seem a bit narrow by today's standards, it provided a foundation for learning that would shape intellectual and religious life for centuries to come. It's important to remember that these schools were operating in a very different context than our modern educational institutions. Their primary goal wasn't to produce well-rounded individuals with a broad range of skills. It was to train individuals to serve God and uphold the teachings of the Church. And as we'll see in the next section, this focus on religious texts, Latin, and music would eventually evolve and expand as education began to move beyond the walls of the monastery. So stick around, because the story of medieval education is just beginning. Alright, settle in, because we're about to journey back to a time of intellectual revival, a spark in the relative darkness of the early Middle Ages. Think of it as a sunrise after a long night. We're talking about the Carolingian Renaissance. Now, I know Renaissance might conjure up images of Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, of art and innovation in 15th and 16th century Italy, but hold that thought. This was an earlier, smaller, but no less significant period of renewed interest in classical learning, art and culture that took place in the late 8th and 9th centuries, and it all centered around one very important figure, Charlemagne. Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, was the king of the Franks and eventually the Holy Roman Emperor. He was a powerful military leader, expanding his empire across much of Western and Central Europe. But he was also surprisingly interested in something beyond conquest: education. Charlemagne recognized that a well-educated clergy and aristocracy were essential for the effective governance of his vast kingdom. Imagine trying to run a massive empire when nobody can read or write. It's like trying to build a castle with no blueprints, or worse, someone else's blueprints that you can't understand. So Charlemagne set about reforming the educational system, and his key player in this ambitious project was a scholar named Alcuin of York. Alcuin, a name you might not hear every day, was an English scholar from York, a major centre of learning in Anglo-Saxon England. He was deeply immersed in classical literature and learning. Now, England at this time had its own interesting history, but we are focused on the impact that Alcuin made, so we won't dwell too much on England at this moment. Alcuin was like a walking encyclopedia of the time, deeply versed in everything from grammar to rhetoric, from theology to astronomy. Charlemagne, recognizing Alcuin's brilliance, invited him to his court in Aachen, which served as the imperial capital. This invitation was a pivotal moment. Alcuin became Charlemagne's chief advisor on education, and essentially the architect of the Carolingian Renaissance's educational reforms. Think of Alcuin as Charlemagne's personal professor, but with the added responsibility of reshaping the entire educational landscape of the Frankish Empire. So, what did Alcuin do? Well, for starters, he established the palace school in Aachen. This wasn't just a school for the royal family, it became a center of learning for the brightest minds from across the empire. Noble children, promising young scholars, and even Charlemagne himself attended lectures and participated in discussions. It was like a medieval think tank, a place where ideas were exchanged, debated, and refined. The curriculum at the Palace School focused heavily on the liberal arts, grammar, rhetoric and logic, the trivium and arithmetic, geometry, music and astronomy, the quadrivium. Alcuin believed that a solid foundation in these subjects was essential for understanding scripture, administering the government, and leading a virtuous life. Sound familiar? We'll touch on them again later, but Alcuin's influence extended far beyond the Palace School. He encouraged the establishment of monastic and cathedral schools throughout the empire. He understood that education shouldn't be confined to the elite. It should be accessible to a wider population. He urged bishops and abbots to improve the quality of teaching in their schools, to hire qualified instructors, and to provide students with access to books. And speaking of books, Alcuin played a crucial role in preserving and transmitting classical texts. During the early Middle Ages, many classical works were in danger of being lost forever. Monks diligently copied manuscripts by hand, but the process was slow and laborious. Alcuin oversaw a massive effort to copy and preserve these texts, ensuring that they would be available for future generations. This wasn't just a matter of preserving old books, it was about preserving knowledge, ideas, and cultural heritage. It was about connecting the present with the past and laying the groundwork for future intellectual progress. One of Alcuin's great accomplishments was developing a standardized form of handwriting known as Carolingian minuscule. Before this, handwriting styles varied widely, making it difficult to read and copy texts. Carolingian minuscule was clear, legible, and elegant. It made books easier to read and more accessible, contributing significantly to the spread of literacy. It's kind of like the development of a universal font that everyone could use, ensuring that information could be shared more effectively. Beyond the practicalities of preserving texts and standardizing handwriting, Alcuin also encouraged original scholarship and writing. He himself wrote extensively on theological and educational topics. He composed textbooks, poems, and letters, all aimed at promoting learning and moral improvement. He even wrote letters to Charlemagne, advising him on matters of state and reminding him of the importance of justice and piety. The Carolingian Renaissance, driven by Charlemagne's vision and Alcuin's expertise, had a profound impact on the intellectual and cultural landscape of Europe. It laid the foundation for the later medieval intellectual flowering, including the development of universities and the rediscovery of classical learning in the High Middle Ages. Now, it's important to remember that the Carolingian Renaissance wasn't a complete transformation. It was a spark, a revival, not a wholesale revolution. The focus was still primarily on religious learning, and access to education was still limited to a relatively small segment of the population. But it was a crucial step forward, a vital period of intellectual growth that helped to shape the course of Western history. So the next time you hear about the Middle Ages, remember Alcuin of York, the quiet scholar who helped to revive learning and preserve knowledge during a time of great upheaval. He might not be as famous as some of the other figures from this period, but his contribution to the development of Western education is undeniable. And that, my friends, is a story worth remembering. We can thank Alcuin for being the champion of reading and writing during a dark time. Just imagine if he had never accepted the offer from Charlemagne to teach. This just goes to show how important teachers are to shaping the world. All right, settle in everyone. It's time to move on from the quiet cloisters and candlelit scriptoriums of our monastic schools. While those institutions were undeniably vital in preserving knowledge during the early Middle Ages, they weren't exactly churning out graduates destined for worldly careers. Let's just say, the curriculum wasn't really geared towards, running a kingdom, or negotiating treaties, or even, managing a bustling marketplace. So what happened next? Well, as Europe began to emerge from the so-called Dark Ages, around the 11th and 12th centuries, something fascinating started to happen. Towns and cities began to swell, trade routes expanded, and with this increased social and economic complexity came a growing need for educated individuals. Not just monks who could flawlessly copy manuscripts, but people who could read, write, calculate, and perhaps most importantly, think. Enter the cathedral schools. Now, the concept itself isn't exactly revolutionary. Cathedrals, of course, were the seats of bishops, the administrative and spiritual centers of their diocese, and cathedrals, like monasteries, always had some form of educational provision, often attached to them. Think of it as a basic training ground for future clergy. But these early cathedral schools were typically rather rudimentary. They were mostly focused on training choir boys, teaching basic literacy and religious knowledge to young men destined for the priesthood. The big change comes with the expansion and professionalization of these institutions. As cities grew, so did the demand for a wider range of skills. Merchants needed people to keep accounts. Royal officials needed scribes to draft documents. And even wealthy laymen began to see the value in a good education, not necessarily to enter the church, but to improve their standing in society. Cathedral schools, conveniently located in these burgeoning urban centers, were perfectly positioned to meet this need. They started to attract students from a wider social spectrum. No longer just the sons of peasants destined for a life of prayer, but also the children of merchants, artisans, and even minor nobility. But attracting students isn't enough. You need to teach them something, right? And that's where another key development comes in, the improvement of the curriculum. Many cathedral schools began to move beyond the basic religious training that had characterized their early years. They started to incorporate elements of what we now call the liberal arts, things like grammar, rhetoric, and logic, which formed the foundation of a well-rounded education. This shift was often driven by charismatic and ambitious teachers, individuals who had perhaps studied in other, more advanced schools, or who had a particular passion for classical learning. These teachers, often called scholastics, began to breathe new life into the cathedral schools, transforming them from simple training grounds for priests into vibrant centers of intellectual activity. Think of someone like Fulbert of Chartres. He was the Bishop of Chartres in the early 11th century, but he was also a brilliant scholar and teacher. He transformed the Cathedral School of Chartres into one of the most prestigious educational institutions in Europe. Students flocked to Chartres from far and wide to study under Fulbert, and his emphasis on classical learning and philosophical inquiry helped to shape the intellectual landscape of the High Middle Ages. What made these schools different? Well, for one thing, they were far more accessible than monastic schools. Monasteries, by their very nature, were somewhat isolated from the outside world. They were often located in rural areas, and admission was typically restricted to those who had taken religious vows. Cathedral schools, on the other hand, were right in the heart of the city, open to anyone who could afford the tuition fees. And that's another key point: tuition fees. While some cathedral schools offered scholarships to poor students, most relied on tuition payments to fund their operations. This meant that they were much more responsive to the needs of the market, so to speak. If there was a demand for a particular skill or subject, the school was more likely to offer it in order to attract students and generate revenue. The rise of cathedral schools wasn't just about expanding educational opportunities. It was also about creating a new type of educated individual, someone who was not just pious and knowledgeable about religious matters, but also capable of critical thinking, effective communication, and skillful problem solving. These were the skills that were increasingly in demand in a rapidly changing world. And this new type of educated individual would go on to play a vital role in shaping the future of Europe. Graduates of cathedral schools became lawyers, administrators, diplomats, and even kings. They staffed the royal courts, managed the church's vast estates, and negotiated treaties with foreign powers. So the next time you think about medieval education, don't just picture monks hunched over manuscripts in dimly lit monasteries. Remember the bustling cathedral schools, the ambitious teachers, and the eager students who were laying the foundations for a new era of intellectual and social progress. These schools represent a crucial turning point in the history of education, a shift from the preservation of knowledge to the active pursuit of understanding. And that, my friends, is a pretty big deal. Alright, settle in, because we're about to dive headfirst into the intellectual heart of medieval education. We're talking about the curriculum of cathedral schools, specifically the trivium grammar, rhetoric, and logic. Think of it as the foundational toolkit for just about everything else they were trying to accomplish. Now, after the relative intellectual stagnation that followed the fall of the Roman Empire, things started to pick up speed, especially with the rise of these cathedral schools. Unlike the monastic schools, which primarily focused on training monks and preserving religious texts, cathedral schools aimed to educate a wider range of students, including those destined for careers in the church administration, royal courts, and even, eventually, the burgeoning towns and cities. And this broader aim demanded a broader curriculum. Enter the trivium. First up, grammar. Now, before you start picturing endless verb conjugations and diagramming sentences, though, okay, there was some of that. Understand that medieval grammar was far more encompassing than what you might remember from high school. It wasn't just about correct sentence structure, it was about mastering the entire Latin language. Latin was the lingua franca, the common language of scholarship, religion, and administration across Europe. If you wanted to read the Bible, The church fathers, classical texts, legal documents, or pretty much anything of intellectual substance, you needed Latin, and that meant mastering its grammar. The primary textbook for grammar was Ars Minor and Ars Major by Aelius Donatus, a 4th century Roman grammarian, and Priscian's Institutiones Grammaticae. Imagine trying to learn a complex language like Latin with textbooks that were already several centuries old, but these texts were considered authoritative, and students would pore over them, memorizing declensions, conjugations, and grammatical rules. They would practice reading and writing Latin, starting with simple sentences and gradually progressing to more complex texts. Think of it like building a house, one brick, or, Latin noun at a time. The goal wasn't just rote memorization, though there was definitely plenty of that. The goal was to develop a deep understanding of the structure and nuances of the Latin language so that they could both comprehend complex texts and express themselves clearly and effectively in writing. Then we move on to rhetoric. Okay, so grammar gives you the raw materials, the words and the rules to put them together. Rhetoric teaches you how to use those materials to persuade, to impress, and to communicate effectively. It's the art of eloquent speaking and writing, of crafting arguments that resonate with your audience. It's about more than just sounding smart. It's about moving people to action, convincing them of your point of view, and let's be honest, winning arguments. The go-to text for rhetoric was often Cicero's De Invention. Think of Cicero as the ancient Roman master of spin, a skilled politician and orator who knew how to sway public opinion. Medieval students studied his works meticulously, analyzing his rhetorical techniques and practicing their own speeches and debates. They learned about different types of arguments, logical fallacies to avoid and to recognize in their opponents, and the importance of tailoring their message to their audience. Imagine the pressure of having to deliver a persuasive speech in Latin, knowing that your every grammatical error and rhetorical misstep would be scrutinized by your teachers and peers. Talk about stage fright. Rhetoric wasn't just about public speaking, though. It also played a crucial role in writing official documents, composing letters, and even preaching sermons. A well-crafted legal argument, a compelling diplomatic letter, or a moving sermon could all have a profound impact on the world. Rhetoric was the key to wielding power through language. It was a fundamental skill for anyone who aspired to a position of influence in medieval society. Finally, we arrive at logic, sometimes also known as dialectic. Now, if grammar is about the structure of language and rhetoric is about the art of persuasion, logic is about the science of reasoning. It's about developing the ability to think critically, to identify flawed arguments, and to construct sound logical arguments of your own. It's like learning the rules of a game, but instead of points and prizes, you're aiming for truth and understanding. Logic builds upon grammar and rhetoric, providing the framework for analyzing arguments and constructing valid proofs. Aristotle's logical works, particularly his Organon, were central to the study of logic in the Middle Ages. Students learned about syllogisms, categorical propositions, and other logical concepts. They would engage in debates and discussions, honing their ability to identify fallacies, challenge assumptions, and defend their own positions. Imagine a group of medieval students huddled over a text, arguing about the validity of a particular syllogism. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Seems simple enough, right? But the real challenge came in applying these logical principles to more complex and controversial issues. For example, does God exist? Is the soul immortal? These were the kinds of questions that medieval scholars grappled with, using the tools of logic to explore the boundaries of human knowledge and understanding. The Trivium, as a whole, was designed to provide students with a solid foundation in the basic skills of language, communication, and reasoning. These skills were essential for success in any field of study, whether it was theology, law, medicine, or philosophy. By mastering grammar, rhetoric, and logic, students were equipped to read, write, speak, and think critically, abilities that would serve them well throughout their lives. Think of it as the ultimate mental workout, preparing them for the intellectual challenges that lay ahead. And it all started with the trivium. It sounds like a lot, right? And it was. But remember, these were the building blocks for pretty much everything else. So next time, we'll ease into the next level of study, the quadrivium. Get ready for some numbers, shapes, music, and stars. Alright, so we've seen how important the trivium was: grammar, rhetoric, and logic. Those were the building blocks, the essential tools for understanding and communicating. But medieval scholars weren't content to just stop there. They wanted to understand the very fabric of the universe, the underlying mathematical principles that governed everything. And that's where the quadrivium comes in. Now, the quadrivium, that sounds kind of intimidating, right? Like some kind of secret society or a complicated spell. But really, it's just a fancy Latin word meaning the four ways or four roads. These four roads were arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. And together, they represented the mathematical side of the liberal arts, a pathway to understanding the cosmos and our place within it. Let's start with arithmetic. Now, before you start picturing endless columns of numbers and dusty textbooks, remember that for medieval scholars, arithmetic wasn't just about calculation. It was about the essence of numbers, their inherent properties and relationships. Think of it less like balancing your checkbook and more like contemplating the very nature of quantity. They were fascinated by prime numbers, perfect numbers, and the symbolic significance of different numerical ratios. For example, the number 3 was often associated with the Trinity, while the number 4 represented the earthly realm, the 4 elements, the 4 seasons. Numbers weren't just tools, they were keys to unlocking spiritual truths. And it's important to remember that their number system wasn't quite the one we use today. Roman numerals were still very common, which made complex calculations challenging to say the least. Imagine trying to multiply CCLV by XLX. It's enough to give anyone a headache, isn't it? Arabic numerals, the ones we use today, were slowly making their way into Europe, but their adoption was gradual. So medieval arithmetic often involved using counting boards and abaci, physical tools that helped visualize and manipulate numbers. Next up, we have geometry. Again, this wasn't just about memorizing formulas for area and volume. For medieval thinkers, geometry was about the study of spatial relationships, the beauty and harmony of shapes, and the underlying geometric principles that governed the physical world. They saw geometry as a reflection of God's perfect design, a way to glimpse the divine order in creation. They studied the works of Euclid, the ancient Greek mathematician, and were particularly fascinated by the 5 Platonic solids, the tetrahedron, cube, octahedron, dodecahedron, and icosahedron. These perfectly symmetrical shapes were seen as representing the fundamental building blocks of the universe, each associated with one of the elements. Think about the rose windows in Gothic cathedrals. Those intricate designs, with their complex patterns and radiating symmetry, are a testament to the medieval understanding and appreciation of geometry. They weren't just decorative, they were visual representations of mathematical principles, designed to inspire awe and reverence. And the construction of those cathedrals themselves, that was applied geometry on a grand scale. Medieval builders used geometric principles to design soaring arches, sturdy foundations, and perfectly proportioned spaces, creating structures that stood as testaments to both human ingenuity and divine inspiration. Now let's move on to perhaps the most surprising member of the quadrivium, music. You might be thinking, music? What does that have to do with mathematics? But for medieval scholars, music was deeply intertwined with mathematical principles. They saw music as an expression of numerical ratios, a manifestation of mathematical harmony in the audible realm. They studied the works of Pythagoras, who discovered the mathematical relationships between musical intervals. He found that consonant intervals, like octaves, fifths, and fourths could be expressed as simple numerical ratios, 2, 1, 3, 2, and 4, 3, respectively. This discovery led to the idea that the entire universe was governed by mathematical proportions, a concept known as the harmony of the spheres. Medieval music theory focused on understanding these ratios and applying them to the creation of melodies and harmonies. They developed a system of musical notation which allowed them to precisely record and transmit musical ideas. They also explored the ethical and emotional effects of different musical modes and harmonies, believing that music could influence the soul and shape character. And of course, music played a central role in religious life, with Gregorian chant being a particularly important form of musical expression. Think about the soaring melodies and intricate harmonies of medieval church music. It wasn't just about creating beautiful sounds, it was about using mathematics to evoke a sense of the divine. Finally, we arrive at astronomy. For medieval scholars, astronomy was much more than just stargazing. It was about understanding the structure of the cosmos, the movements of the planets, and the influence of the heavens on earthly affairs. They believed that the universe was a carefully ordered system, governed by mathematical laws, and that by studying the stars, they could gain insights into God's plan for humanity. They used instruments like astrolabes and quadrants to measure the positions of stars and planets, and they developed complex models of the universe based on the geocentric or Earth-centered model. Now, we know today that the Earth isn't the center of the universe, but for medieval scholars, this model made sense based on their observations and philosophical beliefs. Astronomy was also closely linked to astrology, the belief that the positions of the stars and planets could influence human events. While we might dismiss astrology as superstition today, for medieval people, it was a serious science used to predict the future, diagnose illnesses, and even make important decisions. The calendar itself was based on astronomical observations, with festivals and holy days timed to coincide with solstices, equinoxes, and other celestial events. So that's the quadrivium: arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. 4 pathways, 4 ways of understanding the mathematical order of the universe. And while the specific content and methods of these disciplines may have differed from what we learn today, the underlying goal was the same: to use reason and observation to unlock the secrets of the cosmos and to discover the divine harmony that underlies all of creation. It was a truly holistic approach to education, one that sought to integrate knowledge, faith, and experience. Alright, settle in everyone, because in this section we're diving deep into how these medieval minds were actually molded. Forget modern classrooms with interactive whiteboards and, well, any technology at all. We're talking about a completely different world of learning. The cornerstone of medieval education, especially in the early period, was memorization. Absolute, unwavering memorization. Think about it. Books were rare, incredibly expensive, and chained to shelves in libraries, if those libraries even existed. The printing press, centuries away, so the human brain was the primary storage device for pretty much everything. And I mean everything. Students, even young ones, were expected to memorize vast quantities of text, from the Psalms and prayers to entire books of the Bible. We're talking about potentially hundreds of pages of text, committed to memory word for word. Can you imagine asking a student today to memorize just 1 chapter of a book? It would be a challenge, to say the least. But for medieval students, it was just part of the daily grind. How did they do it? Well, repetition was key. They would recite the texts aloud, over and over again. This brings us to our second crucial teaching method: chanting. Now, chanting wasn't just for religious ceremonies, although it was certainly a staple of monastic life. It was also a powerful tool for learning and retaining information. Think of it like this: putting information into a rhythmic, melodic form makes it easier to remember. It's why we can still remember the lyrics to songs we haven't heard in years. Medieval teachers, consciously or unconsciously, harnessed this power of music to embed knowledge deep into their students' minds. Chanting wasn't just monotonous drone either. It involved a precise intonation and rhythm, making the learning process less of a chore and more of a, well, maybe not fun, but certainly more engaging than simply reading aloud. And it helped to standardize pronunciation, particularly of Latin, which was the universal language of learning. The daily life of a student would have been filled with the sounds of voices rising and falling in unison, reciting prayers, passages from scripture, and grammatical rules. Imagine being surrounded by that all day, every day. It's definitely a different vibe than our schools today, isn't it? A constant chorus of learning echoing through the halls. And then there was dictation. Now, dictation wasn't just a test of spelling and grammar, although those things were certainly important. It was also a crucial exercise in developing writing skills, which were, remember, highly valued and relatively rare. Think of it as a combination of note-taking and transcription. The teacher would read aloud from a text, often a religious work or a classical author, and the students would meticulously copy down the words letter by letter. This process not only reinforced their knowledge of the material, but it also helped them to learn proper handwriting, punctuation, and even the art of illumination, decorating the text with elaborate designs. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute, if books were so rare, where were these students writing? Well, they used a variety of materials. Wax tablets were common, especially for younger students. These were basically wooden boards covered in a layer of wax, which could be easily scratched with a stylus and then smoothed over to erase the writing. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a reusable notepad. For more permanent writing, they used parchment, which was made from animal skin. Parchment was expensive, so it was typically reserved for important documents and final copies. And of course, they used ink, which was usually made from natural materials like oak galls and iron salts. So imagine yourself as a young medieval student. You're sitting in a cold, dimly lit classroom, surrounded by the sound of chanting. The teacher begins to read, and you carefully transcribe the words onto your wax tablet or parchment, trying your best to keep up. You're not just passively listening, you're actively engaged in the process of creating knowledge. But the point of dictation extends beyond simple transcription. It was about training the mind to focus, to listen attentively, and to translate spoken words into written form. It honed skills in observation, concentration, and accuracy, qualities that were highly valued in medieval society. In an age before widespread literacy, the ability to read and write was a powerful tool, and dictation was a key method for developing those skills. These three methods, memorization, chanting, and dictation, were intertwined and mutually reinforcing. Memorization provided the foundation of knowledge, chanting helped to solidify that knowledge in the memory, and dictation developed the practical skills necessary to record and disseminate that knowledge. They seem simple, perhaps even rudimentary, compared to modern teaching methods, but they were incredibly effective in their own way. They produced scholars who were deeply knowledgeable, highly articulate, and capable of preserving and transmitting the intellectual heritage of the past. It's a testament to the power of these traditional methods, and a reminder that sometimes the simplest approaches can be the most profound. And while it might seem a little intense to our modern sensibilities, it fostered a deep sense of community and shared learning. Everyone was in it together, chanting the same texts, copying the same words, and striving to achieve the same goals. It was a collective effort, and that sense of shared purpose undoubtedly played a significant role in shaping the minds and characters of medieval students. And maybe, just maybe, something we could still learn from today. Alright, settle in friends, because we're about to embark on a journey to a pivotal moment in medieval education, the birth of the university. Yes, the university, as we know it. Now, before you picture ivy-covered walls and students frantically scribbling notes, let's set the scene. We're moving away from the solitary confines of monasteries and the expanding scope of cathedral schools and into a whole new landscape of learning. Think of it like this: up until this point, education was largely tied to the church. Monasteries and cathedrals were the keepers of knowledge, and their primary goal was, understandably, religious instruction. But as society evolved, so did the demand for different kinds of knowledge, for different kinds of skills. Trade was booming, cities were growing, and there was a need for lawyers, administrators, and, well, just learned people. Enter the university. The first universities weren't built by kings or popes, at least not initially. They arose organically, almost like intellectual co-ops. Think of them as guilds but for scholars. Students and teachers banded together, forming associations to protect their rights, set standards, and ensure the quality of instruction. It was a bit of a wild west of academia, if you can imagine such a thing. We're going to focus on three of the earliest and most influential universities: Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. Each had its own unique character and contributed something special to the development of higher education. Let's start in Bologna, in Italy. Bologna, often hailed as the very first university, really started to take shape in the late 11th and early 12th centuries. It was driven primarily by the study of law, Roman law, specifically. Rediscovering and understanding the Justinian Code, a comprehensive collection of Roman laws, was huge at the time. It was seen as a way to bring order and justice to a chaotic world. Now, Bologna was unique in that it was largely student-run. Can you imagine that? Students, mostly adults and often wealthy, hired the professors. They set the curriculum, they determined the fees, and they even had the power to fine or fire teachers who didn't meet their expectations. Talk about student power. These student guilds, known as nascinas, grouped students based on their origin, offering mutual support and a collective voice. They were incredibly powerful. Being a professor in Bologna could be a risky business. You had to be good, you had to be engaging, and you definitely had to keep your students happy. Moving north, we arrive in Paris. The University of Paris, unlike Bologna, grew out of the Cathedral School of Notre Dame. This meant it had a slightly different character, more closely tied to the church, at least in its early days. The focus here was on theology and the liberal arts. Paris quickly became the place to study theology. Thinkers like Peter Abelard, whom we'll meet later, drew students from all over Europe to hear their lectures and engage in intellectual debate. The University of Paris was organized more along faculty lines. The professors held more sway than the students, unlike in Bologna. The university was divided into 4 faculties: arts, medicine, law, and theology. To study theology, you first needed to master the arts: grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. So the liberal arts served as the foundation for further study. This emphasis on a broad, well-rounded education became a hallmark of the Parisian model. Now let's hop across the channel to Oxford. The origins of Oxford are a little murkier than Bologna or Paris. Legend has it that Oxford was founded after English students were expelled from the University of Paris in the late 12th century. Whether that's entirely true or not, Oxford quickly established itself as a center of learning in its own right. Like Paris, Oxford emphasized the liberal arts, but it also developed a strong tradition in the sciences, particularly mathematics and astronomy. Thinkers like Robert Grosseteste, one of the early chancellors of Oxford, championed the importance of observation and experimentation. While it wasn't quite the scientific method as we understand it today, it was a crucial step in that direction. Grosseteste was interested in everything, from optics and the nature of light to theology and moral philosophy. He exemplified the spirit of intellectual curiosity that thrived at Oxford. One of the things that really set Oxford apart was its collegiate system. Instead of living in scattered lodgings throughout the town, students lived in colleges, which were residential communities that provided housing, meals, and often additional instruction. These colleges fostered a strong sense of community and intellectual exchange. They also provided a structured environment that helped to regulate student life and maintain order. So what did these early universities have in common? Well, despite their differences, they all shared a commitment to learning and a desire to advance knowledge. They all offered a standardized curriculum, at least in the liberal arts. They all had a system of examinations and degrees, and they all attracted students from far and wide, creating a truly international community of scholars. These universities were transformative institutions. They not only trained the next generation of lawyers, doctors, theologians, and administrators, but they also helped to shape the intellectual landscape of Europe. They fostered critical thinking, encouraged debate, and preserved and transmitted knowledge across generations. They laid the foundation for the modern university system we know today, and that, my friends, is quite a legacy. Alright, so we've followed our bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, or perhaps just bright-eyed, young scholars through the cathedral schools. Now imagine the next step: university. The universities of the medieval period were truly revolutionary. Places like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford weren't just centers of learning, they were melting pots of ideas, of rebellion, and, well, let's be honest, a fair amount of drunken debauchery. Life as a medieval university student, well, it wasn't exactly the idyllic image of quiet contemplation some might picture. First off, picture this: you're probably about 14 or 15 years old, maybe even younger. You've traveled, maybe for days, weeks, even months from your home, leaving everything you know. You likely don't speak the local language perfectly, and you're surrounded by hundreds, maybe even thousands of other young men, and it was mostly men, sadly, all vying for the attention of a few esteemed masters. Student culture was vibrant, chaotic, and often downright unruly. These weren't highly structured campuses with carefully planned activities. Instead, picture something more akin to a sprawling, self-governing community. Students organized themselves into nations based on their geographical origin. Think of it as a medieval version of a college dorm, but with intense regional pride and frequent disagreements. These nations provided a sense of belonging, support, and, crucially, protection from the townspeople, with whom relations were often strained. Tensions between town and gown, as they called it, were a constant source of drama. Think noise complaints taken to the extreme. We're talking brawls, riots, even full-scale wars between students and locals. Imagine a bunch of sleep-deprived teenagers, fueled by cheap wine and a strong sense of entitlement, clashing with shopkeepers and tavern owners. Things could get messy, and often did. Beyond the brawls, though, there was a real sense of camaraderie. Students lived together, studied together, and yes, often drank together. They shared meager resources, supported each other through difficult times, and formed lifelong bonds. These friendships, forged in the crucible of academic rigor and youthful exuberance, were often the most valuable thing they took away from their university experience. Now, let's talk about the lectures themselves. Imagine sitting in a large, drafty hall, packed shoulder to shoulder with other students. The lecturer, usually a robed master, stands at a raised platform, reading aloud from a manuscript. There were no printing presses at this time, remember, so books were rare and precious. The master's voice is the only source of information. No PowerPoints, no handouts, just the master's voice, the rustling of parchment, and the scratching of quills as students frantically try to take notes. And those notes were crucial. Because there were no textbooks, students essentially had to create their own. They would painstakingly transcribe the master's lectures, word for word if possible, creating their own personal compendiums of knowledge. These notebooks, called reportationes, were highly prized possessions, passed down through generations of students. The lectures themselves were often structured around the reading and commentary on authoritative texts, usually by figures like Aristotle, Plato, or church fathers like Augustine. The master would read a passage, then offer his own interpretation, drawing on other sources and engaging in complex arguments. It could be a long and arduous process. Imagine hours spent dissecting a single sentence, teasing out its hidden meanings and implications. But the real intellectual fireworks came during the debates. Debates were the heart and soul of medieval university education. They were formal, structured affairs governed by strict rules of logic and argumentation. Students would take opposing sides of a proposition, presenting their arguments, refuting their opponents, and defending their own positions. These weren't just casual discussions, they were highly competitive, often passionate, displays of intellectual prowess. Students would hone their skills in rhetoric, logic, and dialectic, learning to think on their feet and articulate their ideas with clarity and precision. The goal wasn't just to win the debate, but to demonstrate their mastery of the subject matter and their ability to engage in rigorous intellectual inquiry. Think of it like a medieval version of a televised debate, but with much more Latin and significantly less personal insults. Well, maybe. The best debaters were highly respected, even feared, for their ability to dismantle opposing arguments with ruthless efficiency. These debates weren't just academic exercises, they were training grounds for future lawyers, theologians, and politicians. The skills honed in the university debating halls were essential for navigating the complex world of medieval society. The ability to argue effectively, to persuade others to see your point of view, was a valuable asset in any profession. And it wasn't just about memorizing facts and reciting dogma. Medieval universities, despite their sometimes rigid structure, were also places of intellectual innovation. Students and masters were constantly questioning, challenging, and refining existing knowledge. They were pushing the boundaries of human understanding, exploring new ideas, and developing new ways of thinking. Scholasticism, a dominant philosophical approach during this time, emphasized the use of reason to understand and defend Christian doctrine. Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas sought to reconcile faith and reason, using logic and argumentation to explore complex theological questions. This intellectual ferment led to significant advancements in fields like theology, philosophy, law, and medicine. So university life in the Middle Ages wasn't just about rote learning and drunken brawls, it was about intellectual exploration, critical thinking, and the development of essential skills that would serve students well throughout their lives. It was a vibrant, chaotic, and ultimately transformative experience that helped to shape the intellectual landscape of the medieval world and beyond. It really was a remarkable time. Alright, settle in, because now we're diving into the real meat of university education in the Middle Ages, the 7 liberal arts. Think of these as the core operating system for the medieval brain, the essential skills you needed to, basically think properly. And they were split into 2 key groups, the trivium and the quadrivium. Sounds intimidating, doesn't it? But trust me, it's simpler than it seems. Let's start with the foundation, the trivium. The word itself means the place where 3 roads meet. In this case, those 3 roads were grammar, rhetoric, and logic. Think of them as the building blocks of effective communication. First up is grammar. Now before you start picturing dusty old textbooks filled with conjugations and declensions, let's consider what grammar actually is. It's not just about memorizing rules, it's about understanding the structure of language. It's about learning how words fit together to form coherent sentences, and how those sentences build into larger, more complex arguments. In the medieval university, grammar wasn't just about Latin, although that was a huge part of it. It was about understanding the underlying principles of language itself, so you could analyze texts, interpret meanings, and ultimately express yourself clearly and accurately. Think of it as the blueprint for language, providing a framework for constructing clear and effective communication. A good grasp of Latin grammar was absolutely essential. Latin was the language of scholarship, the church, and diplomacy. Without it, you were pretty much cut off from the entire intellectual world. So a deep understanding of Latin grammar formed the bedrock of their linguistic skills. Next we have rhetoric. Okay, so you understand the rules of language. Now what? Rhetoric is about how you use those rules to persuade, to convince, and to move an audience. It's the art of effective communication, the ability to craft arguments that are not only logically sound, but also emotionally compelling. A student would study the works of classical rhetoricians like Cicero and Quintilian, learning about different persuasive techniques, figures of speech, and the art of delivery. Imagine a skilled medieval orator, captivating a crowd with their carefully crafted words, their passionate delivery, and their mastery of rhetoric. They could sway opinions, inspire action, and even change the course of history, all through the power of persuasive speech. Rhetoric wasn't just about public speaking, though. It was also about writing persuasive letters, crafting legal arguments, and even preaching sermons. Any situation where you needed to convince someone of something, rhetoric was your key tool. Finally, we arrive at logic, sometimes called dialectic. This is where things get really interesting. Logic is all about the art of reasoning, about constructing valid arguments and identifying fallacies. It's about thinking critically and systematically, about breaking down complex problems into smaller, more manageable parts. Medieval students would learn about syllogisms, deductive reasoning, and the different types of logical fallacies. They would engage in intense debates, honing their skills in argumentation and critical thinking. Imagine two students locked in a heated debate, each trying to expose the flaws in the other's reasoning, using logic as their weapon. It was a mental workout, a way to sharpen the mind and develop the ability to think clearly and rationally. Logic was absolutely crucial for understanding complex theological arguments, legal proceedings, and scientific theories. It provided a framework for analyzing information, identifying biases, and arriving at sound conclusions. So the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic provided the essential tools for effective communication and critical thinking. But it was only half the story. Once you'd mastered the trivium, you were ready to move on to the quadrivium. The quadrivium consisted of arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. These were considered more advanced subjects, dealing with the quantitative and mathematical aspects of the world. First, arithmetic. Now, this wasn't just about adding and subtracting, it was about understanding the fundamental properties of numbers, about exploring mathematical relationships, and about applying mathematical principles to solve practical problems. Medieval arithmetic often involved complex calculations using Roman numerals, which could be quite challenging, but it also involved exploring concepts like ratios, proportions, and the properties of different types of numbers. Arithmetic wasn't just an abstract exercise, it had practical applications in commerce, accounting, and even medicine. Then we have geometry. This wasn't just about memorizing shapes and formulas. It was about understanding the spatial relationships between objects, about exploring the properties of lines, angles, and surfaces, and about applying geometric principles to architecture, engineering, and surveying. Students would study the works of Euclid, learning about geometric proofs and constructions. Imagine a medieval architect using geometry to design a magnificent cathedral, ensuring that every arch, every pillar, and every window is perfectly proportioned. Geometry wasn't just about building structures, it was also about understanding the underlying order and harmony of the universe. Next up is music. Now you might be thinking, what does music have to do with anything? Well, in the Middle Ages, music was considered a mathematical science. It was believed that the same mathematical ratios that governed the movements of the planets also governed the harmonious intervals in music. Students would study the mathematical principles of harmony, learning about the relationships between different musical notes and intervals. They would learn to compose music according to strict mathematical rules, creating complex and beautiful melodies. Music wasn't just a form of entertainment, it was a way to understand the mathematical order of the cosmos. It was believed to have a profound effect on the soul, bringing harmony and balance to the individual. And finally, we come to astronomy. This wasn't just about stargazing, it was about understanding the movements of the celestial bodies, about charting the positions of the stars and planets, and about using astronomical knowledge for navigation, calendar making, and even astrology. Medieval astronomers believed that the movements of the planets influenced events on Earth, and they used astronomical calculations to predict the future. Students would study the works of Ptolemy and other classical astronomers, learning about the geometric model of the universe. Astronomy wasn't just a scientific pursuit, it was a way to understand our place in the cosmos, to connect with the divine order of the universe. So there you have it, the trivium and the quadrivium, the 7 liberal arts. These were the core subjects of university education in the Middle Ages, providing students with a comprehensive foundation in language, logic, mathematics, and the sciences. Mastering these subjects was considered essential for anyone who wanted to pursue a career in law, medicine, theology, or government. It was a rigorous and demanding curriculum, but it produced some of the greatest thinkers and scholars in history. And hopefully, now you have a better understanding of what it was like to be a student in a medieval university, grappling with these challenging but ultimately rewarding subjects. Alright, settling in. Good, because now we're wading into some seriously fascinating intellectual territory, scholasticism. Now the word itself, scholasticism, might sound a bit dry, almost like a bad cough syrup you had to choke down as a kid. But trust me, behind that somewhat imposing name lies a period of incredibly vibrant and important philosophical development. Think of it as medieval Europe doing some serious mental heavy lifting. So what exactly is scholasticism? Well, at its core, it was a method of learning, a way of thinking, and a philosophical system that dominated medieval universities from roughly the 11th century right through to the 16th, and its main overarching goal, to reconcile faith, specifically Christian faith, with reason, to show that these two seemingly disparate forces could not only coexist, but actually complement and strengthen each other. Now, why was this such a big deal? Because up until this point, faith as revealed through the Bible and the teachings of the Church had been the primary source of truth for most people in Europe. Reason, as represented by the classical philosophers like Aristotle and Plato, had been largely, well, not exactly forgotten, but definitely relegated to a secondary position. Think of it like this. Faith was the reigning monarch, and reason was a trusted advisor who mostly stayed in the background. But as medieval society began to evolve, with the rise of universities and increased contact with other cultures, especially through the rediscovery of classical texts preserved by Islamic scholars, there was a growing desire to understand the world in a more rational, systematic way. People started asking questions, big questions, like if God is all-powerful and all-knowing, why is there so much suffering in the world? Or how can we be sure that what we believe is actually true? These were questions that couldn't always be answered by simply quoting scripture. People wanted logical arguments, philosophical justifications. They wanted to understand their faith, not just blindly accept it. And that's where scholasticism comes in. Scholastic thinkers believed that God had given humans the gift of reason, and that this gift should be used to explore and understand the world around them, including the mysteries of faith. They believed that truth was a unified whole, and that both faith and reason were essential tools for uncovering that truth. Think of it like this. Faith provides the foundational principles, the starting points, while reason provides the tools to build upon those foundations, to explore their implications, and to create a coherent and consistent worldview. Now, how did they actually do this? What methods did they use to reconcile faith and reason? Well, the scholastic method typically involved a rigorous process of questioning, argumentation, and debate. It usually started with a question, often a seemingly unanswerable one. Then different viewpoints and arguments would be presented, often drawing upon the writings of classical philosophers, church fathers, and contemporary thinkers. These arguments would be carefully analyzed and debated, with the aim of identifying contradictions, inconsistencies, and ultimately, the truth. One of the key tools used in this process was logic. particularly Aristotelian logic. Scholastic thinkers were masters of deductive reasoning, using logical syllogisms to build complex arguments and to demonstrate the validity of their conclusions. They would dissect arguments, identify fallacies, and construct elaborate chains of reasoning to support their claims. It was a bit like a legal trial, with arguments being presented and challenged, evidence being weighed, and a final verdict being reached. Another important aspect of scholasticism was its emphasis on authority. While reason was valued, it wasn't seen as the only source of truth. The writings of the Bible, the Church Fathers, and recognized philosophical authorities, like Aristotle, were all considered to be authoritative sources, and their opinions were carefully considered and debated. However, these authorities weren't simply accepted blindly. Their writings were subjected to rigorous scrutiny and interpretation, and their arguments were carefully analyzed to see if they held up under logical examination. So, in essence, scholasticism was a grand intellectual project aimed at harmonizing faith and reason and at constructing a comprehensive and coherent understanding of the world. It was a method of learning, a way of thinking, and a philosophical system that profoundly shaped medieval thought and continues to influence Western intellectual tradition to this day. It might sound complicated, and sometimes, well, it was. But it's a fascinating journey, and we're just getting started. Next, we'll look at some of the key figures who shaped this movement, like the brilliant Thomas Aquinas and the slightly more controversial, shall we say, Peter Abelard. So, stay with me, and we'll unravel some more medieval mysteries together. All right, let's settle in now, shall we? We've talked about the rise of scholasticism, this beautiful, ambitious project to bring faith and reason together. But it wasn't just an abstract idea floating in the ether. It was driven by incredibly bright minds, individuals who wrestled with these concepts and shaped the intellectual landscape of their time. Today, we'll focus on two giants of scholastic thought, Thomas Aquinas and Peter Abelard. Now, Peter Abelard, he's often described as brilliant, charismatic, and well, a bit of a controversial figure. He lived in the 12th century, a bit earlier than Aquinas, and his story is just fascinating. Imagine a rock star, but instead of playing a guitar, he's wielding logic and philosophy. Abelard was the hotshot lecturer of his day, drawing students from all over Europe to hear him debate and discuss the great questions. He taught in Paris, which was rapidly becoming a major center of learning, and his lectures were apparently electrifying. I mean, can you imagine being excited about logic? He made it happen. What made Abelard so captivating? Well, first he had a razor-sharp mind. He was a master of dialectic, which is essentially the art of logical argumentation. Think of it as intellectual sparring, where you use reason and evidence to defend your position and dismantle your opponents. Abelard was good at this, really, really good. He could take any argument, turn it inside out, and expose its weaknesses. But he wasn't just a skilled debater. Abelard also challenged traditional interpretations of scripture and dogma. He wasn't afraid to question authority, and that of course ruffled some feathers. He believed that reason could be used to understand and even refine religious beliefs. This was quite a bold position to take at a time when faith was generally considered to be above questioning. One of Abelard's most famous works is Sic et Non, which translates to yes and no. In this book, he collected seemingly contradictory statements from the Church Fathers on various theological issues. His goal wasn't to undermine faith, but rather to encourage critical thinking and to show that these apparent contradictions could be resolved through careful analysis and reasoning. Basically, he was saying, hey, let's not just blindly accept everything, let's actually think about it. Of course, Abelard's story isn't just about intellectual pursuits. He is also remembered for his, let's say, complicated personal life. He had a passionate and ultimately tragic affair with Helois, a brilliant and well-educated young woman. Their story has become legendary, a tale of forbidden love, intellectual companionship, and devastating consequences. Helois became pregnant, they secretly married, and then things went south. To put it mildly, Helois entered a convent, and Abelard, well, he was physically attacked and emasculated. It's a truly heartbreaking and complex story that's worth exploring further, but for our purposes, it's important to remember that Abelard was a man of great passion, both intellectually and emotionally. His personal struggles often intertwined with his intellectual pursuits, shaping his worldview and influencing his writings. Now let's move on to Thomas Aquinas. While Abelard was a fiery, controversial figure, Aquinas, who lived in the 13th century, was more of a systematic thinker. He was calm, methodical, and deeply committed to reconciling faith and reason in a comprehensive and coherent way. Imagine building a magnificent cathedral, stone by stone, carefully and deliberately. That's kind of how Aquinas approached philosophy and theology. Aquinas was heavily influenced by the rediscovery of Aristotle's works. Aristotle, the ancient Greek philosopher, had been largely forgotten in Western Europe for centuries, but his writings were reintroduced through Arabic scholars. Aquinas saw in Aristotle a powerful tool for understanding the natural world and for constructing a rational framework for knowledge. He believed that Aristotle's philosophy could be used to complement and support Christian theology. His most famous work is the Summa Theologica, a massive and incredibly detailed theological treatise. It's divided into hundreds of questions, each of which is explored through a rigorous process of argumentation. Aquinas would present objections to his own position, then offer his own reasoned response, and finally, refute the objections. It's a painstaking, methodical approach, but it allowed him to explore complex theological issues with remarkable clarity and precision. One of Aquinas's key contributions was his development of natural law theory. He argued that there is a natural moral order in the world that can be discovered through reason. This natural law is based on God's eternal law, but it's accessible to all people, regardless of their religious beliefs. Aquinas believed that human laws should be based on natural law, and that unjust laws are not really laws at all. Aquinas also made significant contributions to our understanding of God's existence. He offered 5 proofs for the existence of God, based on reason and observation of the natural world. These proofs, often referred to as the 5 ways, are still debated and discussed by philosophers today. So how do Abelard and Aquinas compare? Well, both were brilliant thinkers who sought to integrate reason and faith, but they approached this project in different ways. Abelard was more of a rebel, challenging traditional authorities and pushing the boundaries of acceptable thought. Aquinas was more of a systematizer, building a comprehensive framework for understanding the world and our place in it. Abelard emphasized the importance of doubt and questioning, while Aquinas emphasized the importance of order and coherence. Both, in their own way, made lasting contributions to Western thought and helped to shape the intellectual landscape of the Middle Ages. They remind us that faith and reason are not necessarily in opposition, but can in fact be complementary ways of understanding the world around us. They both showed us how to think, how to question, and how to strive for truth, even when the answers are difficult and elusive. And that, my friends, is a lesson that's just as relevant today as it was centuries ago. Now let's drift a little deeper. Alright, so we've explored the 7 liberal arts, the bedrock of medieval education. But what if you were aiming for something a little more specialized? What if you wanted to be a healer, a lawyer, or dare I say, a pillar of the church? Well, that's where medicine, law, and theology came into play. Now imagine this. You've diligently mastered your Latin, wrestled with rhetoric, and maybe even convinced yourself you understand logic. You're ready for the next step. For some, that meant delving into the fascinating, albeit often inaccurate, world of medieval medicine. Medical schools began to pop up, most notably in places like Salerno in Italy. This wasn't your modern sterile hospital environment, though. Think more along the lines of crowded classrooms, ancient texts, and a whole lot of guesswork. The foundations of medical knowledge were largely based on the works of Galen, a Greek physician from the Roman era. His theories, while influential, were often, well, let's just say they weren't always spot on. For example, the whole concept of humors, blood phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, needing to be in perfect balance for good health. Imbalances were thought to cause all sorts of ailments, and treatment often involved things like bloodletting or purging to restore harmony. Can you just imagine, someone comes in with a headache, and the doctor's first instinct is to drain some blood? It's a wonder anyone survived, but hey, they were doing their best with the knowledge they had. And it's important to remember they were observing and trying to understand the human body, even if their methods seem a bit medieval to us now. These medical schools weren't just about theory, though. They did involve some practical experience, like observing surgeries and dissecting animals, sometimes even human corpses, although that was often frowned upon and usually done under the cover of darkness. This practical experience, however limited, was crucial in developing skills that could actually save lives. Think wound care, setting bones, and understanding basic anatomy, even if the underlying explanations were a little off. Then there was the world of law. As societies became more complex, so did the need for a formal legal system. The study of law, particularly Roman law, experienced a resurgence in the medieval period, especially at the University of Bologna. Gratian's Decretum, a collection of canon law, church law, became another crucial text. Law school wasn't exactly a walk in the park. Students spent years poring over dusty legal texts, memorizing laws and legal precedents, and participating in mock trials and debates. The aim was to produce skilled lawyers who could navigate the complexities of medieval legal systems, which varied quite a bit depending on the region and the specific type of court. You might be dealing with royal courts, church courts, or even local manorial courts, each with its own set of rules and procedures. The study of law offered a path to power and influence. Lawyers could become advisors to kings and nobles, serve as judges, or represent clients in court, wielding considerable influence over the lives of others. It was a demanding but potentially very rewarding career path. And finally, we come to theology, arguably the most prestigious and influential field of study in the medieval world. If you wanted to understand the mysteries of God, delve into the scriptures, and become a leader in the church, theology was the path for you. Theology was the queen of the sciences, seen as the ultimate pursuit of knowledge. Major theological schools flourished at universities like Paris and Oxford. Students spent years studying the Bible, the writings of the Church Fathers, and the works of contemporary theologians. They grappled with complex questions about the nature of God, the relationship between faith and reason, and the meaning of human existence. Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, who we mentioned earlier, played a crucial role in shaping medieval theological thought. His Summa Theologica became a cornerstone of Catholic theology, attempting to synthesize Aristotelian philosophy with Christian doctrine. Theology wasn't just an academic exercise, though. It had profound implications for every aspect of medieval life, from politics and law to art and morality. Theologians served as advisors to popes and kings, shaping policy and influencing public opinion. They were also responsible for educating the clergy and ensuring the spiritual well-being of the population. Becoming a theologian wasn't easy. It required years of dedicated study, a sharp intellect, and a deep commitment to faith. But for those who succeeded, the rewards were immense. They could rise to positions of power and influence within the church, shaping the course of history and leaving a lasting legacy on the world. So medicine, law, and theology offered specialized paths for those seeking knowledge and influence beyond the liberal arts. While the methods and understanding in medicine might seem primitive by today's standards, and law might appear overwhelmingly complex and theology incredibly rigid, each played a crucial role in shaping medieval society. They represent the intellectual ambition and the yearning for understanding that characterized this fascinating period in history. Now close your eyes and imagine yourself a medieval scholar poring over ancient texts by candlelight. Alright, settle in folks, because now we're turning our attention to something a little different. Something, shall we say, practical. We've been spending all this time exploring the rarefied air of monasteries, cathedrals, and universities, places dedicated to abstract thought and the finer points of Latin grammar. But what about the vast majority of medieval kids, the ones who weren't destined for a life of prayer or pontificating? What kind of education did they receive? Well, for most medieval children, education wasn't about passing Virgil or debating Aristotle. It was about learning a trade. It was about acquiring the skills necessary to contribute to the household, to the community, and ultimately, to survive. And that's where guilds and apprenticeships come into play. Think of guilds as the medieval equivalent of trade unions combined with professional associations. They were organizations of craftsmen, artisans, and merchants, all practicing the same trade. They regulated everything from the quality of goods produced to the prices charged, and most importantly for our purposes, they oversaw the training of new members. Becoming a master craftsman, a fully fledged member of a guild, wasn't a walk in the park. It involved a long and rigorous period of apprenticeship, typically starting around the age of 7 or 8, sometimes even younger. Now imagine being pulled away from playtime, from exploring the woods, to spend years learning the ins and outs of, say, blacksmithing, or weaving, or baking. Sounds intense, doesn't it? But this was the reality for countless medieval children. The apprenticeship system was a structured hierarchy. At the bottom you had the apprentice, the newbie, the eager but inexperienced youngster. The apprentice would be bound by contract, often a legal document, to a master craftsman for a specific period, usually 7 years. This contract outlined the responsibilities of both parties. The master agreed to provide food, lodging, clothing, and of course instruction in the trade. The apprentice in turn pledged to be obedient, hard-working, and to not reveal any trade secrets. Imagine being responsible for all of those things at such a young age. Life as an apprentice wasn't easy. It was a lot of hard work, a lot of cleaning, a lot of fetching and carrying, and a lot of waiting. You wouldn't just immediately jump in and start forging swords or weaving tapestries. No. You'd start with the basics, cleaning the workshop, tending the fire, preparing materials, and generally making yourself useful. You'd be learning by observation, watching the master and journeyman, we'll get to them in a minute, at work, absorbing their techniques and their knowledge. Slowly, gradually, as you proved yourself trustworthy and capable, you'd be given more responsibility. You might start by learning to sharpen tools or to prepare dyes for the cloth. Then perhaps you'd be allowed to assist in more complex tasks, holding a piece of metal steady while the master hammered it, or helping to thread the loom. The master craftsman wasn't just a teacher, he was also a surrogate parent. He was responsible for the apprentices' well-being, for their moral upbringing, and for ensuring they learned not just the technical skills of the trade, but also the values of honesty, integrity, and craftsmanship. It was a relationship built on trust, but also on authority and discipline. A master could, and often did, use corporal punishment to correct mistakes or to enforce obedience. This wasn't seen as cruel or unusual. It was simply part of the educational process, though it might sound harsh to us now. Of course, after several years of apprenticeship, if the apprentice had proven himself skilled and diligent, he'd become a journeyman. The term journeyman comes from the French word journée, meaning day. A journeyman was a skilled worker who was paid by the day. Unlike an apprentice, he was no longer bound to a single master. He could travel from town to town, working for different masters, honing his skills, and gaining experience. This period of travel and independent work was crucial for a journeyman's development. It allowed him to learn different techniques, to see how other workshops operated, and to broaden his knowledge of the trade. It also gave him the opportunity to save money and to eventually establish his own workshop. The ultimate goal for a journeyman was to become a master craftsman himself. To achieve this, he had to produce a masterpiece, a piece of work that demonstrated his mastery of the trade. This masterpiece would be judged by the guild masters, and if it met their standards, the journeyman would be admitted into the guild as a full member. Now that was something to celebrate. The process of crafting the masterpiece was incredibly important. Think of it like a thesis defense, but instead of writing a paper, you're building a chair, or painting a portrait, or crafting a suit of armor. This piece had to showcase not only technical skill, but also creativity, originality, and a deep understanding of the principles of the craft. It was the culmination of years of training and experience, a testament to the journeyman's dedication and talent. Once accepted into the guild, the new master could open his own workshop, hire apprentices, and participate fully in the life of the guild. He would be bound by the guild's rules and regulations, but he would also enjoy the benefits of membership, including protection from competition, access to resources, and a voice in the governance of the trade. So what kinds of trades were taught through this system? Well, pretty much anything you can imagine. Blacksmithing, carpentry, masonry, weaving, tailoring, baking, brewing, leatherworking, goldsmithing, and countless others. Guilds existed for almost every craft and trade imaginable, reflecting the diverse needs and skills of medieval society. And it's important to remember that this wasn't just about learning a specific skill. It was also about instilling a set of values: hard work, discipline, attention to detail, and a commitment to quality. Guilds played a vital role in shaping the character of medieval artisans, fostering a sense of pride in their work and a dedication to excellence. Beyond the formal apprenticeship system, there was also a considerable amount of informal craft education that took place within families. Children often learned the skills of their parents, helping out in the family workshop or on the farm from a young age. This kind of informal training was particularly common in rural areas, where access to guilds might be limited. It's how farming skills were passed from generation to generation, of course. So the next time you admire a medieval cathedral, a finely crafted piece of furniture, or a beautifully illuminated manuscript, remember the countless hours of training, the dedication, and the hard work that went into creating it. Remember the medieval school kids, not learning their Latin declensions, but hammering iron, weaving cloth, or baking bread. Their education might have been different from ours, but it was just as important, just as rigorous, and just as essential to the functioning of medieval society, and perhaps, in some ways, a little more, well, practically useful in day-to-day life. All right, settle in, and let's talk about the education of girls and women in the Middle Ages. Now, before we dive in, it's important to acknowledge right from the start that their opportunities were, well, significantly more limited than those afforded to their male counterparts. Society's expectations, deeply rooted in religious and social norms, largely defined their roles as wives, mothers, and managers of the household. Formal education, as we understand it, simply wasn't considered necessary for most women, but that doesn't mean opportunities were entirely absent. Two primary avenues existed for female education: convents and noble households. Let's start with the convents. These religious institutions were often the only places where women could receive a structured and relatively comprehensive education. Think of them as little heavens of learning, shielded from the outside world. Entering a convent offered women a chance to dedicate their lives to God, yes, but also to intellectual pursuits. The curriculum in convents usually centered on religious texts. Nuns needed to be able to read the Bible, understand liturgical texts, and participate fully in the daily services. Latin, the language of the church, was therefore a crucial component of their education. They would painstakingly copy manuscripts, ensuring the preservation of religious knowledge, a task that required not just literacy, but also artistic skill and meticulous attention to detail. But their education wasn't just religious. Many convents also taught practical skills. Things like medicine and herbal remedies were essential, as convents often served as healthcare providers for the surrounding community. Nuns would cultivate medicinal gardens, learn about different ailments, and prepare remedies to alleviate suffering. They were the healers of their time, offering comfort and care to those in need. Beyond medicine, many convents excelled in artistic pursuits. Weaving, embroidery, and illumination were common activities. They created beautiful tapestries, elaborate vestments, and stunning illuminated manuscripts, showcasing their artistic talents and contributing to the aesthetic beauty of the church. Music was also important. Singing and playing instruments were part of the daily routine, and some convents even produced accomplished musicians and composers. One of the most famous examples of a well-educated woman from this period is Hildegard of Bingen, a Benedictine abbess. Hildegard was a visionary, a composer, a writer, a philosopher, and a medical expert. Her extensive knowledge and intellectual achievements were a testament to the opportunities that convents could provide. Her writings cover theology, botany, medicine, and music, and her compositions are still performed today. She corresponded with emperors, popes, and other influential figures, demonstrating her intellectual prowess and her ability to engage in complex discussions on a wide range of topics. She truly was a remarkable figure. However, it's crucial to remember that even within the convent walls, opportunities weren't equal for everyone. Social class played a significant role. Nuns from noble families often received a more comprehensive education than those from poorer backgrounds. They might have been taught additional languages, literature, or other subjects deemed appropriate for their station, and, just as in society as a whole, women in positions of authority, abbess, for instance, had greater opportunities for learning and leadership. Now, let's turn our attention to noble households. While formal schooling was rare for girls outside of convents, some aristocratic families recognized the value of educating their daughters. The quality and extent of their education depended largely on the wealth, status, and progressive mindset of their families. Noble girls were often taught to read and write, primarily in their vernacular language, whatever local language was spoken. This allowed them to manage household affairs, correspond with family members, and read devotional texts. However, the emphasis was often on practical skills rather than academic pursuits. They were trained in household management, learning how to oversee servants, manage finances, and organize banquets and other social events. These were skills considered essential for running a large estate. Etiquette and social graces were also paramount. Noble girls needed to know how to behave in court, how to converse with dignitaries, and how to dance and sing. They were expected to be accomplished in the arts of courtly love, charming and captivating potential suitors. Think of it as a finishing school, but in the Middle Ages, needlework was another important skill. Noble women were expected to be skilled in embroidery and other forms of needlework, creating beautiful tapestries, clothing, and other decorative items. These skills were not just for personal enjoyment, but also served as a way to display their family's wealth and status. Unlike the structured curriculum of convents, education in noble households was often less formal and more personalized. Tutors were sometimes employed to teach girls alongside their brothers, but their education was typically tailored to their expected roles in society. While boys were prepared for careers in the military, politics, or the church, girls were primarily being prepared for marriage. And that really was the crux of it, wasn't it? A woman's primary purpose in the Middle Ages, regardless of her social status, was to marry and bear children. Education, therefore, was often seen as a means to an end, to make her a more desirable and capable wife. While intellectual pursuits might be encouraged to some extent, they were rarely considered as important as her ability to manage a household, raise children, and maintain social connections. So while opportunities for education did exist for women in the Middle Ages, they were limited and often shaped by societal expectations. Convents provided a haven for intellectual pursuits and practical skills, while noble households offered a more personalized education focused on household management and social graces. But ultimately, the overarching goal was to prepare women for their roles as wives and mothers in a patriarchal society. And that's something to remember as we continue to explore the wider world of medieval education. Sleep well. Alright, let's talk about the education of the really privileged kids back in medieval times. The ones born into royal or noble families. Think castles, fancy clothes, and a completely different set of learning objectives compared to your average peasant lad. Forget about monasteries, or even those fancy cathedral schools for a moment. For these kids, education wasn't just about reading and writing, although those were definitely important. It was about preparing them to rule, to lead armies, and to uphold the very specific social code of their class. And that code, my friends, was often wrapped up in something called chivalry. Now chivalry, it's a word we throw around a lot, and it often conjures up images of shining knights in armor, rescuing damsels in distress. And well, that's part of it. But it's so much more nuanced and honestly, a little bit contradictory. Chivalry was essentially a moral code, a set of ideals meant to govern the behavior of knights and nobles. It emphasized things like courage, honor, justice, loyalty, and courtesy. Think of it as a medieval gentleman's guide to being a decent or at least appearing decent human being. If you were born into the right social class, of course. And this wasn't just about being nice to people, though that helped. Chivalry was deeply intertwined with military prowess. A knight was expected to be a skilled warrior, brave in battle, and dedicated to protecting the weak and innocent, but also, conquering lands and asserting his lord's dominance. Like I said, it's complicated. So how did they learn all of this? Well, a lot of it was through observation and imitation. Young boys, often sent to the court of another noble or even the king, would act as pages and squires, essentially apprentices to seasoned knights. They'd learn how to ride, how to fight with various weapons, and how to care for their armor. They'd watch how the knights behaved in court, how they interacted with each other, and how they treated the ladies. And let's be honest, a lot of it was also about learning by doing. If a young knight in training behaved badly, well, there might be some consequences. Let's just say that discipline wasn't exactly optional. But chivalry wasn't just about battlefield heroics and physical prowess. It also encompassed a whole system of social graces, and this is where courtly love comes into the picture. Courtly love, sigh. Get ready for some romanticized, idealized, and often completely unrealistic views on relationships. This wasn't necessarily about marriage, in fact. Often it wasn't at all about marriage. It was about the idealized devotion of a knight to a lady, usually a woman of higher social standing. He would perform acts of service for her, write her poetry, sing her songs, and generally put her on a pedestal. Think of it like a very elaborate, highly stylized form of admiration. And the lady in turn was expected to inspire the knight to be a better person, to be more courageous, more virtuous, and of course more chivalrous. It was all very dramatic and theatrical. It was all about longing, yearning, and unattainable affection. Think Romeo and Juliet, but perhaps a little less tragic, maybe. Okay, sometimes it was pretty tragic. This whole courtly love thing might seem a bit silly to us today, but it actually played a significant role in shaping social interactions and even artistic expression in the Middle Ages. It influenced literature, music, and even fashion. It also helped to elevate the status of women, at least in theory. I mean, let's face it, the realities of medieval life were often very different from the romantic ideals of courtly love, but it's important to understand the influence of these ideals on the way people thought about relationships. Of course, royal and noble education wasn't all about fighting and romancing. There was also the small matter of learning how to govern. After all, these kids were going to be in charge of entire kingdoms or vast estates someday, so they needed to learn about law, politics, and economics. They would study history, learning about the rise and fall of empires and the deeds of great rulers. They'd learn about the laws of the land, the rights and responsibilities of different social classes, and the art of diplomacy. They'd also need to know how to manage their finances, how to collect taxes, and how to oversee the administration of their lands. This part of their education often involved spending time with experienced advisors, shadowing their parents or other relatives in their official duties, and attending councils and meetings. They were essentially learning on the job, observing how decisions were made and how power was wielded. And let's not forget, they also had to learn how to read and write, often in multiple languages, so that they could communicate effectively and manage their affairs. Latin was crucial, of course, but increasingly they'd need to understand and speak the vernacular languages of their own lands. French, English, German, whatever it happened to be. So there you have it, a glimpse into the education of medieval royalty and nobility. It was a complex and multifaceted process, designed to prepare them for a life of privilege, power, and responsibility. It was a world of chivalry, courtly love, and governance, where ideals often clashed with reality and where the stakes were incredibly high. It was a different world, that's for sure. And it's fascinating to consider, especially when you realize how many of these ideas, even if they're a little dusty and tarnished, still echo in our world today. Alright, settle in, because now we're going to talk about something a little more exclusive, the world of tutors and private education for the elite in the Middle Ages. When we think of medieval schools, we often picture those bustling cathedral schools or the hallowed halls of the early universities, but that was just part of the picture. For the truly wealthy and powerful, the system looked very different, and it was all about personalized learning experiences, tailored to their specific needs and future roles. Think about it. If you're a king, a queen, a powerful lord, or a wealthy merchant, are you going to entrust your child's education to just anyone, or to a crowded classroom? Probably not. Your child, especially if they were a potential heir, was an investment, and a private education was seen as essential for ensuring their success and maintaining their family's status. So who were these tutors? Well, they came from a variety of backgrounds. Some were Benedictine monks or members of other religious orders. They had the knowledge, the Latin skills, and often a reputation for piety and learning. Others were secular scholars, masters of the liberal arts who had perhaps spent time at a university and then sought employment in a noble household. And still others were skilled knights or experienced courtiers who could teach practical skills like swordsmanship, horsemanship, and courtly manners. The curriculum, of course, was highly customized. A young boy destined for knighthood might spend less time poring over Latin grammar and more time learning about military strategy, falconry, and the art of jousting. He would still learn to read and write, of course, but the focus would be on skills that were relevant to his future role. For girls from noble families, education was similarly tailored, although often with a different emphasis. While they might learn some Latin, the focus was often on domestic skills, household management, embroidery, music, and dancing. They were taught how to run a large household, manage servants, and entertain guests, preparing them for their future roles as wives and mothers. Knowledge of herbal remedies and basic medicine was also common, as they were often responsible for the health and well-being of their families and communities. And don't think they were dummies, not at all. Many noble women became patrons of the arts, and some, like Hildegard of Bingen, became major intellectual figures in their own right. It all came down to the quality of the tutor. One of the great advantages of private education was the ability to learn at one's own pace and in a style that suited the individual student. Tutors could adapt their teaching methods to the student's strengths and weaknesses, providing individualized attention that was simply impossible in a large classroom setting. They could also focus on specific areas of interest or need, ensuring that the student received the best possible preparation for their future. And it wasn't just about academics and practical skills. Tutors were also responsible for instilling moral values, good manners, and a sense of social responsibility in their students. They served as role models, mentors, and confidants, shaping not only their students' minds but also their characters. They would have instructed their pupils in proper decorum at court, the importance of honor, and how to treat those of lower status. This was critical for cementing the social hierarchy and maintaining order. The location of this private education was also quite different from formal school settings. More often than not, lessons would take place in the child's home, be it a grand castle or a wealthy merchant's townhouse. Sometimes a tutor would travel with the family, providing instruction on the go. This allowed for learning to be integrated into the child's everyday life and provided ample opportunities for hands-on experience. Think about learning about botany while actually walking through the castle gardens, or learning about history while visiting important historical sites. Now, access to tutors and private education wasn't cheap. It was a significant investment, one that only the wealthiest families could afford. It was a status symbol, a way of demonstrating their wealth and power. But it was also seen as a necessity, a way of ensuring that their children would be well prepared for the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. In fact, hiring a well-regarded tutor could even improve a family's standing in society. It signaled their commitment to education and their desire to provide their children with the best possible start in life. So while monastic and cathedral schools laid the foundation for broader education in the Middle Ages, it's important to remember that private education played a crucial role in shaping the lives of the elite. It was a personalized, intensive, and often highly effective form of learning that helped to maintain social hierarchies, prepare future leaders, and preserve and transmit knowledge within a select few. Think of it as the ultimate bespoke education experience, tailored to the individual needs and aspirations of the wealthiest and most powerful members of medieval society. And with that, let's move on, shall we? Alright, settle in everyone. Let's dim those lights a little. We're diving into the wonderful world of medieval textbooks and how all that handwritten knowledge actually got into the hands of eager, or maybe not so eager, learners. It's a story of patience, painstaking labor, and surprisingly clever innovations. Now, forget everything you think you know about popping down to the bookstore for the latest edition. In the medieval period, books were precious. Think valuable art objects, not disposable paperbacks. Every single book, every single page had to be painstakingly created by hand. That's where manuscript production comes in. The primary centers for this production were, unsurprisingly, monasteries. Monks, with their dedication to God and a relatively stable lifestyle, had the time, resources, and crucially, the scriptoria, dedicated writing rooms, to undertake this enormous task. Imagine a room filled with the quiet scratching of quills, the smell of parchment, and the focused concentration of men, and sometimes women, copying texts, letter by letter. It was slow, meticulous work. A single book could take months, even years to complete. So what were they copying? Well, initially, the focus was on religious texts, of course. The Bible, commentaries on scripture, liturgical works for the daily services. But monasteries also played a crucial role in preserving classical learning. Think about it. Without the dedication of these monks, many of the works of ancient Greece and Rome would have been lost forever. They diligently copied the works of Cicero, Virgil, Aristotle, and other giants of the ancient world, ensuring their survival for future generations. The materials they used were just as important as the texts themselves. Parchment, made from animal skin, usually sheep, goat, or calf, was the primary writing surface. It was durable, allowing for corrections and erasures, and provided a smooth surface for writing. Preparing parchment was a whole process in itself, involving soaking, scraping, stretching, and treating the skin to make it suitable for writing. You really get a sense of how much effort went into creating just one page. The ink was typically made from natural ingredients, like oak galls, those little growths you sometimes see on oak trees, mixed with iron sulfate and gum arabic. This created a rich, dark ink that was remarkably permanent. Different colors were used for decoration, particularly red ink for headings and important passages. This is where the term rubric comes from the Latin ruber, meaning red. The process of creating a manuscript was typically divided among several people. The librarius was responsible for copying the text itself. The illuminator added decorations, such as elaborate initials, borders, and miniature illustrations. The corrector checked the text for errors, and the binder assembled the finished pages into a book, sewing them together and covering them with a protective binding, often made of wood covered with leather or vellum. Think of the illuminated manuscripts you might have seen in museums, those breathtakingly beautiful books with intricate gold leaf and vibrant colors. They weren't just pretty, they served a purpose. The illustrations helped to explain the text, making it more accessible to those who couldn't read. They also added to the book's value and prestige, making it a treasured possession. As cathedral schools and universities began to emerge, the demand for books increased dramatically. This led to the development of new methods of manuscript production. Instead of relying solely on monastic scriptoria, booksellers and stationers began to organize workshops where scribes could copy texts for sale. This was a significant step towards a more commercial book trade. The rise of universities also led to the development of new types of textbooks. These weren't just copies of classical works, they were designed specifically for teaching. Think of commentaries on Aristotle, summaries of legal principles, and medical treatises. These textbooks were often organized according to the curriculum of the university, making them easier for students to use. The Pesha system was one clever innovation that helped to speed up the production of textbooks. A master copy of a text would be divided into sections or pesha, which were then rented out to different scribes to copy. This allowed multiple scribes to work on the same text simultaneously, significantly reducing the time it took to produce a complete copy. Think of it as a medieval version of distributed computing, but with handwriting. Distributing these books, though, remained a challenge. Before the printing press, there was no mass production, so you couldn't just order hundreds of copies to be delivered. Instead, books were typically sold directly by the scribes or booksellers who produced them. Students often had to travel long distances to find the books they needed. Some universities even had regulations about the sale and rental of books to ensure that students had access to the materials they needed to study. So what were the textbooks that medieval school kids actually used? For younger students, textbooks often consisted of simple grammar books like Donatus's Ars Minor, which taught the basics of Latin grammar. They also used collections of model letters and dialogues to practice their writing skills. Older students studying the liberal arts would have used textbooks on grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. These textbooks were often based on the works of classical authors, but they were adapted and expanded to meet the needs of medieval students. The cost of books was a major barrier to education for many people. A single book could cost as much as a small farm, making it unaffordable for all but the wealthiest individuals. This is why memorization played such an important role in medieval education. Students had to commit large amounts of information to memory because they couldn't rely on having access to textbooks. The development of manuscript production in the medieval period was a remarkable achievement. It ensured the preservation of classical learning, facilitated the spread of knowledge, and laid the foundation for the printing revolution that would transform education in the centuries to come. It's easy to take books for granted today, but understanding the painstaking process of manuscript production gives us a much greater appreciation for the value of these precious objects and the dedication of the people who created them. Now close your eyes and imagine the scratching of those quills. All right, settle in, because now we're diving into something truly fundamental, the evolution of literacy in the Middle Ages. It's easy to take reading and writing for granted these days, but back then it was a much more exclusive club, a skill slowly spreading and transforming society. For a long time, literacy was primarily the domain of the clergy. Think about those monks painstakingly copying manuscripts, letter by letter. Reading and writing weren't just practical skills, they were almost sacred acts, preserving religious knowledge and maintaining order within the church. Latin was the language of God, the language of scholarship, and the key to unlocking a world of learning, if you could decipher it. But things were changing. As towns grew and trade flourished, the need for written communication expanded beyond the church walls. Merchants needed to keep records, guilds needed to formalize their rules, and rulers needed to administer their kingdoms. Slowly, a new class of literate individuals began to emerge: scribes, lawyers, and clerks, all essential for the smooth functioning of medieval society. Now let's consider the reading process itself. It wasn't always the silent individual activity we know today. Often reading was done aloud, even when someone was alone. This was partly because manuscripts were expensive and often shared, but also because people were simply used to processing information orally. Think of it as a holdover from a largely oral culture. Imagine a student hunched over a text, slowly sounding out the words, the rhythm and cadence almost as important as the meaning. And what about writing? Well, the tools were rather different than our sleek pens and keyboards. Imagine using a quill, carefully sharpened and dipped in ink, to create each letter on parchment or vellum. It was a slow, deliberate process, requiring patience and a steady hand. Mistakes were costly, as parchment was precious and difficult to erase. These constraints shaped the very style of writing, leading to the development of intricate scripts and abbreviations designed to save space. But the really big shift, the gradual rise of vernacular languages, that is, the languages spoken by everyday people, like Old English, Old French, and Old High German. For centuries, Latin had reigned supreme in written form, but slowly these vernacular languages began to creep into documents, poems, and even legal texts. Why this change? Well, partly it was about accessibility. If you wanted to reach a wider audience, you needed to communicate in their language, but it was also about a growing sense of national identity. As kingdoms and regions developed their own distinct cultures, their languages became symbols of that identity. Think about the great works of medieval literature: Beowulf in Old English, the Song of Roland in Old French, the Divine Comedy by Dante Alighieri, written in the Florentine dialect which ultimately helped solidify modern Italian. These works not only entertained and inspired, but also helped to legitimize and standardize vernacular languages, paving the way for wider literacy and a richer cultural landscape. The process wasn't always smooth, of course. There was often resistance from those who clung to Latin as the language of authority and prestige. But the tide was turning. More and more texts were translated into vernacular languages, making knowledge more accessible to those who didn't have the privilege of a classical education. Consider Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in Middle English. It's a collection of stories told by a diverse group of pilgrims, each speaking in their own voice, reflecting the vibrant tapestry of medieval English society. By writing in English rather than Latin or French, the language of the English court at the time, Chaucer helped to elevate the status of the vernacular and create a literary masterpiece that continues to resonate today. This spread of vernacular languages had profound consequences for education too. While Latin remained important, schools increasingly began to incorporate vernacular grammar and literature into their curriculum. This meant that more people, especially those from less privileged backgrounds, had the opportunity to learn to read and write. The impact of all this was immense. Increased literacy led to a more informed and engaged populace, fostering innovation and creativity in all areas of life. It also empowered individuals to challenge authority, to express their own ideas, and to participate more fully in the world around them. It allowed for the keeping of more personal records. Imagine a merchant being able to track their inventory or a family keeping records of births and deaths. So the evolution of literacy in the Middle Ages wasn't just about learning to read and write. It was about the transformation of society, the rise of vernacular languages, and the democratization of knowledge. It was a slow, gradual process, but its impact was profound and continues to shape our world today. And it all starts to make you wonder, what will literacy look like in another 500 years? Now that's something to consider as you drift off to sleep. Alright, settle in friends, because we're about to step into the world of a medieval school child and take a look at what their learning environment was actually like. It's easy to imagine dusty dungeons and grim conditions, and sometimes that was true, but there's more to the story than that. Let's start with the classroom itself. Now forget the brightly colored classrooms of today, with their interactive whiteboards and comfy chairs. Medieval schools, especially in the earlier period, were often quite simple, sometimes even Spartan. Think of a large shared room, perhaps in a monastery or attached to a cathedral. Space could be limited, so squeezing in could be the norm. Floors were often made of stone or packed earth, maybe covered with rushes or straw for a bit of extra warmth, or to soak up the occasional spill. Windows, if there were any, would be small and high up, letting in a limited amount of light. Glass was a luxury, so often they were just holes covered with oiled parchment or shutters. This meant that classrooms could be pretty dim, especially on cloudy days. Imagine trying to study by candlelight. Furniture, simple benches, maybe a few shared desks or lecterns. The teacher, or master, would likely have a slightly raised platform or chair, a symbolic gesture of authority. There wouldn't be individual desks like we're used to. Instead, students often sat on benches or stools, sharing writing surfaces when available. We're talking communal learning in a very literal sense. And let's be honest, hygiene wasn't exactly a top priority back then. A room full of students, often unwashed, in close proximity, well, let's just say the air might not have been the freshest. It's a far cry from the sanitized environments we expect today. Now let's talk about the real heart of learning: books. Oh, medieval books. These weren't the mass-produced paperbacks we grab at the bookstore. We're talking about meticulously handcrafted manuscripts, each one a work of art. Books were incredibly valuable, painstakingly written by hand on parchment, treated animal skin, think sheep, goats or calves. Each page had to be prepared, ruled, and then carefully inscribed with ink made from things like oak galls or soot. The process was incredibly time-consuming, which made books extraordinarily expensive. Only the wealthiest individuals, the church or institutions, could afford to own them. This meant that access to books was extremely limited for the vast majority of people. Because they were so precious, books were often chained to desks or shelves in libraries to prevent theft. Imagine the weight of responsibility handling such a valuable object. It really puts things into perspective, doesn't it? The content of these books, primarily religious texts of course, the Bible, commentaries on scripture, and liturgical works were staples, but there were also books on grammar, rhetoric, logic, and the other subjects of the liberal arts. Over time, particularly as universities developed, you'd find books on medicine, law, and philosophy as well. And now for the writing tools themselves. Forget ballpoint pens and laptops. Medieval students learned to write with a stylus and wax tablet, or with a quill and ink on parchment. Wax tablets were a kind of reusable notepad. They consisted of a wooden or ivory frame filled with a layer of wax. Students would use a stylus, a pointed instrument, to scratch letters into the wax. The advantage was that you could easily erase your work by smoothing out the wax and start again. This was perfect for practicing letters and basic exercises. For more permanent writing, parchment and quill were the tools of choice. Quills were typically made from the flight feathers of birds, usually geese. The tip of the feather had to be carefully cut and shaped to create a writing point. This was a skill in itself, and students had to learn how to maintain their quills properly. And then there's the ink. As mentioned earlier, medieval ink was often made from natural materials. One common recipe involved oak galls, which are growths that form on oak trees when insects lay their eggs. These galls were crushed, mixed with water and other ingredients like iron sulfate and gum arabic, and then left to ferment. The result was a rich, dark ink that, if properly made, could last for centuries. Using a quill and ink on parchment required patience and skill. It was easy to make mistakes, and correcting them wasn't always easy. You might have to carefully scrape away the ink with a knife, or use a special eraser. Smudging was a constant threat, and keeping your writing neat and legible required a steady hand. The process of learning to write in the Middle Ages was thus a physical and mental exercise. It wasn't just about memorizing letters and words, it was about mastering the tools and techniques of writing. This involved developing fine motor skills, attention to detail, and a deep respect for the written word. So picture it: dim light, simple surroundings, valuable books, and the scratch of quills on parchment. The material culture of medieval schools wasn't glamorous, but it was functional. It was a world where knowledge was precious, and the act of learning was a deliberate, painstaking process. And in a way that makes it all the more fascinating, doesn't it? Alright, settle in, friends, because this next bit, it might make you squirm a little. We're diving into the rather unpleasant but incredibly important topic of discipline and punishment in medieval schools. Now, when we think of medieval education, we often picture dusty classrooms and stern-faced monks, and well, that image isn't entirely wrong. But what exactly did it mean to be a naughty student back then? What were the consequences for, say, dozing off during a particularly long sermon, or maybe, just maybe, accidentally spilling ink all over the professor's meticulously copied manuscript? The reality is, discipline in medieval schools was firm, let's put it that way. The overarching goal wasn't necessarily to nurture a student's individual creativity or self-expression. Instead, it was all about instilling obedience, respect for authority, and crucially, the ability to memorize vast amounts of information. Think of it like shaping rough stones into perfectly uniform building blocks. A delicate process, I'm sure, but a brutal one nonetheless. So, what kind of punishments were we talking about? Well, the most common by far was corporal punishment. And when I say corporal punishment, I mean corporal punishment. This wasn't just a gentle tap on the wrist. We're talking about the liberal application of the rod, the birch, or even just a good old-fashioned slap. The rationale behind this was rooted in the belief that children were inherently prone to sin and needed to be physically corrected to stay on the righteous path. Remember, the church was a central authority in medieval life, and the idea of original sin was very present in daily thought. The idea was that physical discomfort would shock them out of their sinful ways and sharpen their focus. Yes, let's just ponder on that for a moment. The severity of the punishment would of course vary depending on the offense and the teacher. Minor infractions, like talking out of turn or failing to recite a lesson properly, might earn you a few swats. More serious offenses, such as blatant disobedience, disrupting class, or even horror of horrors, damaging books, could result in a much more severe beating. And these weren't exactly private affairs either. Often the punishment would be carried out in front of the entire class. This served as a public shaming, designed to deter other students from following in the offender's footsteps. It's a pretty stark contrast to modern educational practices, where privacy and rehabilitation are usually prioritized. But it wasn't just the teachers who were dishing out the discipline. Older students, particularly those in positions of authority, like prefects, were often given the power to administer punishments to younger or less experienced students. Talk about pressure. This system could, and often did, lead to abuse and bullying, creating a very hierarchical and sometimes unpleasant atmosphere within the school. Now, physical punishment wasn't the only tool in the medieval teacher's arsenal. There were other, perhaps slightly less painful, but still pretty unpleasant, methods of maintaining order. One common punishment was standing for extended periods. Imagine being forced to stand for hours on end in a corner, or even in the middle of the classroom, as a constant reminder of your misdeed. It sounds like torture, doesn't it? No fidgeting allowed, no leaning, just standing. The sheer boredom and physical discomfort would have been a powerful deterrent. Another popular technique was the imposition of extra work. Students might be forced to copy out passages from textbooks or religious texts, often multiple times. Think of it as medieval lines. It might sound tedious, but it was designed to instill discipline and reinforce learning, all while keeping the naughty student occupied and out of trouble. Then there were the fines. This punishment was more common in cathedral schools and later in universities, where students often came from wealthier backgrounds. If a student broke a rule, perhaps by being late to class, engaging in disruptive behavior, or failing to complete an assignment, they might be fined a certain amount of money. These fines would then go towards the upkeep of the school or towards charitable causes. So it was punishment with a purpose, I guess. Shaming rituals also played a significant role. A student might be forced to wear a dunce cap. Yes, that dunce cap, or made to sit in a designated shame seat in front of the class. These public displays of humiliation were intended to be a strong deterrent and to reinforce the importance of adhering to the rules. Can you just imagine the embarrassment of walking in with that hat on? Furthermore, there were also instances of what we might today consider psychological punishment. Teachers might use sarcasm, ridicule, or even just a withering stare to publicly humiliate students. The fear of disappointing or angering a respected teacher could be a powerful motivator for some, while for others it could be deeply damaging. Some teachers even had a book of shame where they recorded every mistake made by a student. Imagine seeing your name in that. Now, it's important to remember that not all medieval schools were bastions of brutality and harsh discipline. Some teachers were known for their kindness and compassion, and they relied more on encouragement and positive reinforcement than on physical punishment. But, let's be honest, those teachers were probably the exception rather than the rule. The level of discipline also varied depending on the age and social standing of the students. Younger children were generally subjected to more frequent and severe physical punishments, while older students, particularly those destined for important positions in the church or government, were often treated with more respect and given more responsibility. But there's another, perhaps more subtle aspect to all of this. In a society that placed a high value on hierarchy, obedience, and tradition, the strict disciplinary practices of medieval schools served a broader social purpose. They helped to reinforce these values and to prepare students for their roles in a rigid and highly structured society. It wasn't just about teaching them Latin grammar or arithmetic, it was about molding them into obedient and productive members of society. So the next time you're tempted to complain about a particularly difficult assignment or a strict teacher, just remember what it was like to be a student in a medieval school. A few extra hours of homework suddenly doesn't seem so bad, does it? And I hope that this little glimpse into the past helps you drift off into some very relaxed and happy dreams, knowing you missed the stick. Alright, settle in, friends. Let's dim the mental lights a little and drift into a truly revolutionary moment in medieval education: the arrival of the printing press. Now, up until this point, knowledge was a painstakingly crafted and closely guarded thing. Think of monks hunched over desks, meticulously copying manuscripts by hand, letter by letter. It was slow, expensive work, and it meant that books, and therefore education, were largely limited to the wealthy elite, the clergy, and a select few others. But then, Johannes Gutenberg, around the mid-15th century, this German goldsmith and inventor tinkered away and created something that would change the world forever: the printing press with movable type. Now, I won't bore you with the intricate mechanics, but the core idea is that instead of carving an entire page onto a woodblock, you could arrange individual reusable letters to form words, then ink them and press them onto paper. Imagine the possibilities. Suddenly, producing books became significantly faster and cheaper. We're talking a dramatic shift. Before, a single book could take months, even years to create. Now, printers could churn out dozens, even hundreds of copies in the same time frame. The impact on the cost was just astounding. Books, once a luxury item accessible only to the upper crust, started to become, well, not exactly affordable for everyone, but definitely within reach of a much larger segment of the population. And what did this mean for education? Well, it was a game changer. First off, it meant that more students had access to textbooks. Think about it. Students no longer had to rely on painstakingly transcribed notes from lectures or share incredibly rare and expensive texts. They could actually own their own books. This dramatically improved their ability to study independently, to revisit complex concepts, and to truly engage with the material. Secondly, the printing press standardized knowledge. Before, because every book was handwritten, there were inevitably variations and errors that crept in during the copying process. Imagine playing a game of telephone, but with entire books. The printing press allowed for mass production of identical copies, ensuring that students and scholars across different regions were all working from the same source material. This in turn fostered a more unified and consistent understanding of key subjects. Thirdly, it fueled the growth of literacy. As books became more accessible, more people saw the value in learning to read. The demand for education increased, leading to the establishment of new schools and universities, and the expansion of existing ones. It was a positive feedback loop: more books, more readers, more demand for books, and so on. The curriculum itself also began to evolve. With the printing press making classical texts more readily available, there was a renewed interest in the works of ancient Greek and Roman authors, humanist scholars who emphasized the importance of human reason and potential, championed the study of these texts, leading to a shift in focus away from purely religious dogma and towards a broader understanding of the world. Thinkers like Erasmus, a prominent humanist scholar, used the printing press to disseminate their ideas and challenge traditional ways of thinking. His edition of the Greek New Testament, for example, had a profound impact on religious scholarship and paved the way for the Reformation. The printing press provided a platform for new voices and new perspectives, sparking intellectual debates and fostering a spirit of critical inquiry. And it wasn't just about universities. The printing press also facilitated the rise of vernacular literature. Before, most books were written in Latin, the language of the church and the educated elite. But with printing becoming more widespread, publishers began to produce books in the common languages of the people: English, French, German, and so on. This made knowledge accessible to a wider audience, including those who had not had the opportunity to learn Latin. This had a huge impact on national identities and cultures. Think of writers like Chaucer and Dante, whose works were now more easily disseminated, helping to shape and solidify the vernacular languages and literary traditions of their respective countries. It was a democratization of knowledge, a shift in power from the privileged few to the many. Now it's important to remember that the printing press didn't solve all the problems of medieval education overnight. Access to books was still unevenly distributed, and literacy rates remained relatively low, particularly among the lower classes and women. But the printing press undeniably laid the foundation for a more widespread and accessible system of education, one that would eventually transform society. The ripple effects of this invention were felt far beyond the classroom. It fueled the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the scientific revolution. It empowered individuals, challenged established authorities, and ultimately helped to shape the modern world. So next time you pick up a book, take a moment to appreciate the long and fascinating history of printed knowledge, a history that began with the ingenious invention of Johannes Gutenberg and his printing press. It truly was a revolution in learning, a turning point in the history of human knowledge, and something that, well, it makes you think, doesn't it? And now perhaps a little nap. Alright, settle in friends, because now we're going to get a little more personal. We've talked about the what and the how of medieval education, but what was it actually like for someone living it? Let's zoom in, microscope style, on a couple of fascinating individuals and see how the theories played out in real life. First up, we have Hildegard of Bingen. Now, Hildegard wasn't your average medieval student. Born in 1098, a time when, let's be honest, things were a little less convenient than they are now. She was the 10th child of a noble family. Being the 10th child sometimes meant different things back then. In Hildegard's case, it meant she was offered as a tithe to the church. From the age of 8, she lived with Jutta von Sponheim, a respected anchoress, in a small hermitage attached to the Benedictine monastery of Disibodenberg. Now, life with an anchoress wasn't exactly summer camp. It was a life of prayer, contemplation, and yes, education. Jota was incredibly well regarded and attracted other noble girls to be educated alongside Hildegard, forming a small community. The curriculum here was intensely religious. Hildegard would have spent hours studying the scriptures, learning the Psalms by heart, and mastering the intricacies of the Benedictine rule. Latin, of course, was essential. It was the language of the church, the language of scholarship, the language of, well, basically everything important at the time. She'd have learned to read, write, and chant in Latin, skills crucial for participating in the daily liturgical life of the monastery. But Hildegard's education went beyond the purely religious. Jota, though secluded, was a learned woman. It's believed that she imparted knowledge of herbal medicine, healing practices, and even some elements of natural philosophy. This practical knowledge would later become incredibly important in Hildegard's own work. What's fascinating about Hildegard is that she wasn't just passively receiving information. From a young age, she experienced vivid visions, which she initially kept secret. But as she grew older, and as her education deepened her understanding of scripture and theology, she began to interpret these visions within a Christian framework. Her education provided her with the tools to articulate these experiences, to translate them into theological and philosophical concepts. She wouldn't have been able to write her influential theological works, Civius, Liber Vitae Meritorum, and Liber Divinorum Operum, without a solid grounding in Latin theology and the conventions of medieval writing. Her knowledge of music, likely gained through her monastic training, also allowed her to compose beautiful and spiritually powerful chants and liturgical dramas. Hildegard's case highlights something really important about medieval education, especially for women within religious orders. It wasn't just about rote memorization. It could be a pathway to intellectual and creative expression. It provided her with the framework to explore her own experiences and to contribute meaningfully to the intellectual and spiritual life of her time. She used it as a springboard. Now, let's switch gears completely and travel to the court of England. Let's talk about Geoffrey Chaucer, the author of the Canterbury Tales. Born in London sometime around 1343, Chaucer came from a family that, while not nobility, was certainly well connected. His father was a wine merchant, which meant access to the bustling world of trade and, crucially, access to influential people. Chaucer's education was, in many ways, shaped by his social status and his career aspirations. He wasn't destined for the monastery. Instead, his education was geared towards a life of service to the crown. As a teenager, he served as a page in the household of Elizabeth de Burgh, Countess of Ulster. This was a crucial step. It exposed him to courtly life, to the intricacies of politics, and to the refined culture of the aristocracy. Within this courtly environment, Chaucer would have received an education tailored to his future role. He would have learned French, the language of the English court at the time, fluently. French was essential for diplomacy, for administration, and for participating in courtly society. He would also have studied Latin, though perhaps not to the same depth as someone in a monastic setting. Latin was still the language of law, administration, and scholarly texts, But Chaucer's education wasn't just about languages. He would have been immersed in the literature of the time. He'd have been exposed to romances, allegories, and classical texts. He'd have learned about rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking and writing. These skills were crucial for someone aspiring to a career in public service. Courtly love, chivalry, and all those concepts would have been interwoven into his upbringing. What makes Chaucer's case so interesting is how his education influenced his writing. The Canterbury Tales are a testament to his deep understanding of medieval society, his mastery of language, and his ability to blend different literary traditions. The pilgrims he creates represent a cross-section of medieval life, from the knight to the pardoner, and their tales reflect the diverse influences on Chaucer's own education. His time in the court exposed him to the nuances of social interaction, the humor, the hypocrisy, and the aspirations of different social classes. His knowledge of French literature informed his poetic style and his narrative techniques. His understanding of classical rhetoric allowed him to craft compelling and persuasive characters. Chaucer also served in the military and traveled extensively on diplomatic missions. These experiences further broadened his horizons and enriched his understanding of the world. They gave him a perspective that few of his contemporaries possessed, and that perspective is vividly reflected in his writing. So what can we learn from these two examples? Well, first, they show us that medieval education wasn't a monolithic thing. It varied depending on social status, gender, and career aspirations. Hildegard's monastic education provided her with the tools for spiritual and intellectual exploration, while Chaucer's courtly education prepared him for a life of public service and literary achievement. Second, both cases highlight the importance of language and literature in medieval education. Latin and French were essential tools for accessing knowledge and participating in public life. The study of literature, both classical and contemporary, shaped their thinking and informed their creative expression. Finally, these examples remind us that education is never just about acquiring knowledge. It's about shaping individuals, fostering creativity, and enabling them to contribute to the world around them. Whether through theological treatises, musical compositions, or masterful storytelling, Hildegard of Bingen and Geoffrey Chaucer stand as testaments to the power of medieval education. Even today, they resonate. Alright, so we've journeyed back in time, explored dusty manuscripts, and sat in on some, rather intense lectures. We've really dug into what medieval school kids actually learned. And now, as we reach the end of our journey, it's time to ask, so what? What's the big deal? Why should we care about what happened in those drafty monasteries, those bustling cathedral schools, or those incredibly intimidating early universities? Well, the truth is, the legacy of medieval education is surprisingly pervasive. You see its echoes everywhere. Even today, we might not be memorizing entire books of Psalms or arguing the finer points of Aristotelian logic on the regular, although some of you might be. But the foundations laid down in the Middle Ages still shape how we learn, how we think, and how we structure our knowledge. Think about the university system itself, those institutions that started sprouting up in places like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. They're the direct ancestors of the universities we know and hopefully love today. The very idea of a place dedicated to higher learning, with faculties, departments, and degrees, that all began in the medieval period. The structure is so familiar, it's easy to take it for granted, but it's a direct line of inheritance from those early centers of scholarship. And it's not just the physical structure. Consider the curriculum. We spent a good amount of time talking about the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. These 7 liberal arts formed the core of medieval education. Now, you might not recognize them by those names anymore, but look closer. Grammar is, well, still grammar, understanding language, how it works, how to use it effectively. Rhetoric, that's communication, persuasion, public speaking. Logic, critical thinking, problem solving, argumentation. These are all essential skills that are still taught in various forms in schools and universities around the world. The quadrivium might seem a little more distant, but the principles are still there. Arithmetic and geometry evolved into mathematics, the foundation of so much of our modern technology. Music, it's still a vital art form, and the mathematical principles underlying it are still studied. And astronomy, well, that's become astrophysics and cosmology, helping us understand the vastness of the universe. So, the core skills and knowledge emphasized in medieval education remain incredibly relevant. They might be packaged differently, presented with different tools, but the fundamental building blocks are the same. But there's something even deeper than the curriculum. It's the emphasis on rigorous thinking. The medieval scholars, particularly those immersed in scholasticism, were obsessed with questioning everything, with examining arguments from all sides, with reconciling faith and reason. Figures like Thomas Aquinas and Peter Abelard might be daunting names, but their commitment to intellectual inquiry, to challenging assumptions, and to seeking truth is something we can all learn from. Their methods of debate, their meticulous analysis of texts, their relentless pursuit of understanding, these are skills that are vital in any age, especially in our own, where we are constantly bombarded with information and misinformation. The medieval focus on memorization, while sometimes criticized, also had its benefits. Think about it. Before the printing press became widespread, memory was incredibly important. Being able to recall information, to recite texts, to pass on knowledge orally was a crucial skill. While we rely heavily on external memory aids like computers and the internet now, there's still something to be said for developing a strong memory. It strengthens cognitive function, improves concentration, and allows us to access knowledge more readily. And let's not forget the importance of community in medieval education. Students often lived and studied together, forming close-knit communities of scholars. They debated, argued, and supported each other in their intellectual pursuits. This sense of community, of shared learning, is something that many educational institutions still strive to foster today. Learning isn't just about individual achievement, it's about collaboration, cooperation, and the exchange of ideas. Of course, we also have to acknowledge the limitations of medieval education. It was often exclusive, primarily available to men from privileged backgrounds. Education for women was often limited, and access to knowledge was restricted for many. But even in its limitations, there are lessons to be learned. We can recognize the progress that has been made in expanding access to education, while also acknowledging that there is still work to be done to ensure that everyone has the opportunity to learn and reach their full potential. The struggle for wider access to knowledge and opportunity is a direct continuation of historical disparities. So what's the relevance of medieval education today? It's a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge is a timeless endeavor. It's a testament to the power of human curiosity, to the desire to understand the world around us. It's a legacy that has shaped our educational systems, our ways of thinking, and our understanding of ourselves. By studying the medieval period, we can gain a deeper appreciation for the history of education, the evolution of knowledge, and the enduring importance of learning. And maybe, just maybe, we can learn something from those medieval scholars who, despite their limitations, were so passionately committed to the pursuit of truth and understanding. Perhaps by looking to the past, we can help to build a brighter future for education. And with that, I think it's time for a well-deserved rest. Good night.